Hello and welcome to episode 52 of the Crash and Ride podcast. I'm Patrick Ferguson. I'm your host. This week's guest is Doug Grean. Doug is a recording engineer and record producer with an astonishingly deep resume. He's worked with so many influential artists who've shaped the face of American music over the last 25 or 30 years. But most prominently, Doug was the lead guitar player and music director for Scott Weiland in his solo work after he left Stone Temple Pilots. And as you can imagine, that has been a journey. And we talk about that a lot. But we also talk about Doug's history before and after Scott, and we had a really good talk, and I really enjoyed it. If this is your first episode of Crash and Ride is a long-form interview podcast where I talk to musicians who've survived anxiety, depression, and addiction. My hope is that if we could sort of get together and have honest conversations about the things that really trouble us and make us sad and make it hard for us to be in the world, that we could gather some strength from each other and maybe all get better as a whole. I'm a working musician. I'm a drummer. I'm kind of available right now. Things have been a little slow. I have a band from Tokyo that I play with called Pinky Doodle Poodle, but they're caught in this wild State Department visa application process that just seems absolutely Byzantine and never-ending. So I'm kind of cooling my jets here in Athens, Georgia, where I live. If you've got some shows you need a drummer, just hit me up at crashandride@protonmail.com. Today's interview is a really good one. It's a little long, so I want to jump right into these announcements and then get to the interview as fast as I can. Crash and Ride is brought to you in part by Greer Amplification. Greer Amps builds the best boutique effects pedals available. If you're looking for an overdrive, boost, fuzz, compressor, or tremolo that is rugged, road-tested, and at home, on stage, in the studio, or in your living room, Greer has a pedal for you. Nick and his staff strive to build the best products around with the best tone you've ever heard. They believe in their products, and they stand behind them too, backing each one up with a lifetime warranty to the original owner. Each Greer Amps product is hand-built in Athens, Georgia, USA. Go to www.greeramps.com or visit your favorite music retailer today. Crash and Ride is also brought to you in part by Jittery Joe's, a local coffee roaster based in Athens, Georgia. They have a special espresso blend named after the podcast. You can get Crash and Ride espresso, whole bean or ground, from our website at crashandridepodcast.com. I also have t-shirts for sale up there with the Crash and Ride logo and the slogan "Loud Guitars Save Lives" on it. You can get one of those for $20 plus $5 shipping any day. Go to crashandridepodcast.com/store. Okay, that's all the announcements. So every other episode of Crash and Ride is usually a song explication. If you're a long-time listener, you know that, but if you're just getting here, I usually, in the middle of the week, release an episode where I go end-to-end in a song that I love, and I maybe play a little bit of the parts on my guitar, and I talk about who was on the session and who recorded it and where it was and all that and why I love the song. But, the week before last, I couldn't do it because my daughter was home from school the entire week with the flu, and then right as I was getting ready to do this week, she got sick again, man. My poor kid has had a really rough go the last couple of weeks. She got a sinus infection, got sent home from school, and she just was pathetic, man. And it's been hard to get anything done. I'm just cradling this poor feverish child, but she's back at school now. I'm really looking forward to this next week of getting some work done, so hopefully I'll have a song explication up for you next Wednesday. Okay, about today's episode, I've known Doug Grean for a couple of years now. We've corresponded on the internet a lot, especially about weird amplifiers and drum sounds and that kind of thing. And he's one of my favorite people. We talked about doing this for weeks, but he's been in transition. He's moved from Southern California to just north of New York City, and his whole life's been kind of upside down, and I caught him on a slow morning. He's got a little bit of a cold. You can hear it in the interview, and we talked for a really long time because we just hadn't had a chance to catch up in so long, and I felt like so much of it was so good that I'm leaving 90% of it here. It's such a great conversation, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, what's wild is that we talked about so much. We never even touched on the video series he did for the web called Starman, which is really great, and we never talked about his pet squirrel, Burt Reynolds. There's just so much about Doug that's so interesting, and he's got such an amazingly good heart, and even after almost 2 hours of conversation, I felt like there were things that we just left out. So maybe there'll be a follow-up interview, or maybe we talked a little bit about a podcast that he was working on. Maybe Crash Media, which is the sort of media company I'm starting, will host that. So I guess we'll see. In the meantime, let's just jump into this interview I did with Doug Grean. Okay, I'm here with Doug Grean. He's a record producer, audio engineer, and guitar player. His resume is insane. Sheryl Crow, Ricki Lee Jones, Glen Campbell, Slash, Velvet Revolver, the Stone Temple Pilots, Cyndi Lauper, a million others. Most conspicuously, in my experience, Doug worked with as musical director and lead guitar player for Scott Weiland. That's how I came to know him. But your resume is a mile deep and 2 miles wide, Doug. It's kind of amazing.
Thanks.
You used to be based out of Los Angeles, and now you're just up the river from New York City.
Yeah, I left L.A. a couple months ago. It didn't work out.
You were out there for like 20 years or something, though, right?
I was out there for 26 years, yeah.
Yeah.
It took a long time for us to figure out if we were right for each other, and then it didn't really work out. But, L.A.'s great. I love it. The weather is particularly nice.
But you're originally from upstate New York, right?
I'm from Westchester County, New York, which is like right above the Bronx, and I'm actually standing in Westchester County now again, so I've just come home, basically. I'm about 15 miles from where I was born, but I can't afford to live too close to that area anymore. So
yeah. Did you just bring your whole studio from L.A.? Like, how did that all work?
Well, it wasn't a good situation, really. I got divorced, so, whatever. Or I am getting divorced, so I had to... And I had my studio in my home, which is actually what a lot of guys do now. I'll tell you a funny story if you like stories about producers. I was in an electronic surplus store in Duarte, California, which is way east of LA. Like it's like 45 minutes east out. It's like in the desert, kind of, sort of.
Yeah.
It's out in the middle of nowhere, this place, because that's the only place that he could afford to have his store. Anyways, I'm in there digging through, old surplus electronics for whatever. And this guy walks in and he's wearing I guess he's wearing a Puig Sound, like from Seattle kind of T-shirt. And I was telling the kid that worked there, if you ever find this particular tube, call me right away, because it was the tube for the U-47, and the kid had never heard of this. I forget what it is right now, but anyways, VF-14. So I said, you're telling the kid, showing him what it looks like, and I'm like, if you ever see these, just in case no one's ever told you, even though you're in LA, basically. And the guy standing next to me, who I didn't know, with the Puig thing on, he started talking. So we started talking about microphones, and then I said to him, I said, well, you're an engineer. And he said, yes. And it turned out it was Jack Joseph Puig, right?
What?
It was very famous. Yeah, it was JJP. He's standing right there. So he tells me who he is, and I go, oh, I know who you are. Oh, yeah, great. That's awesome. Yeah, blah. And I said, we work with some of the same people. And I told him who, and he said, oh, I know who you are. And I said, oh, geez, I can only imagine.
Always great to hear.
Well, because he worked with the STP guys, and I worked with that, right? And so he worked on some of the solo projects. So I just figured that, and he was like, yeah, I know you from them. And I was like, oh, cool. I guess. I hope they flagged me too much. But anyways, we had this beautiful conversation. He's a very sweet man. Oh, such a good guy. And I asked him if he still had his room at Ocean Way. I was like, do you still have it? Because for years, he had this JJP room at Ocean Way. If I'm not mistaken, maybe other engineers will correct me, but and it was very opulent and beautiful and full of the sickest gear you could ever imagine. Like, there are pictures of JJP's racks that make you have a small boner, maybe. Like, they're so... Anyways, I said to him, you still have that room? He said, no, I don't have it anymore. He said, I couldn't afford to keep it. Or just that it was an unnecessary expense, basically. And he said, I built a place in my house. And I said, I did the same thing. And it turns out that many guys, even JJP-level guys, build places, either in their houses or behind their houses or whatever. And he said, yeah, I did that because I wanted to have an affordable alternative to artists that I still want to work with.
Right.
And basically, so that's what everybody's doing. And so I'm in my house. I hate saying I'm in my house because I feel kind of like, I'm my studio's in my mom's basement kind of guy. But at the same time, I know that people like JJP also have workshops in their houses because they just want to be able to keep recording, and budgets are, down or gone or whatever.
I've done a session at Brendan O'Brien's studio at his house before, so these things exist. And
do you have a house studio now?
Oh, totally.
He has one.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah. It's behind his place. It's like in the suburban, well, not even suburban Atlanta. Atlanta's got these weird semi-urban pockets of tree-lined, opulent neighborhoods, and he's back in one of those, And I got called in to play some drums. Someone was using Brendan's session. I met Brendan while I was there, but he wasn't running the session. And it's this weird. It's got a sloped. The roof is arched. It's this wild, and it's interesting. The little rack of like these are the go-to guitars. It had like I think a Mexi Telly, which was set up flawlessly and probably had some aftermarket pickups on it, but it wasn't like a $3,000 guitar. And he had a little red label Yamaha acoustic with the bronze strings on it. That was a sort of Elliott Smith guitar. I was really impressed with kind of how like rootsy the place was. It wasn't super extravagant, but it had great gear.
Yeah, he is a very talented guy. I really, really love his work. And he's also a really good guitar player. He played the guitar on that. Didn't he play the guitar on, maybe I'm wrong, I shouldn't say it. I thought he played the guitar on the No Huggy, No Kissy, no, don't keep your hands to yourself.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. But, that was a Southern Tracks session. And, Brendan was at Southern Tracks for many years. He did all the Pearl Jam stuff there.
I know. Well, I know all about Southern Tracks. I never got to go to that place, but good Lord, I heard about it from everyone. Like, because I knew, or I still know Ryan Williams pretty well.
Yeah.
And Ryan came out, and then he went to work with Josh Abraham, and then he became kind of his own guy, and he's a mixer and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But I heard about. I actually went to Atlanta to rescue Scott once from like a really severe binge he was in.
Oh God!
And he was there. He was there with the band, mixing a record at Southern Tracks, and I was only there for 24 hours, so I never got to go to the studio because when I got there, he was in such bad shape. I just bundled him up and took him back to L.A. immediately.
Yeah.
But so I never got to go to that actual studio, but it's closed now, right?
Yeah, but that big SSL console is now at a studio called Madison Studios, which is right off Buford Highway in Atlanta, which is like the ultimate like ethnic eating alley of all time. There's Vietnamese and Senegalese and like a million different like flavors of Spanish cuisine, everything from Mexican, Guatemalan, Honduran, El Salvadoran. I mean, it's all on this one highway, on Buford Highway, and I just love going to do sessions at Madison because, number one, the room sounds amazing, and number two, lunch breaks are phenomenal.
Right.
So you're originally from just north of the city, and now you're back there, which is kind of going full circle. But you were playing music as a teenager. I've read your bio now, and anybody can. It's a really good read on online because there's so much great information there. But you went to New Orleans when you were 18 to study music at Tulane, right?
Yeah, I did, and I stayed there for 9 years, and then I moved to L.A. for 26 years, and then I moved back here. So,
what part of New Orleans were you living in?
Mostly I lived in Uptown, but for a while I lived in Slidell.
Yeah.
Which is way out across the lake. My mom lived out there. I didn't get to work in most of the big studios in New Orleans because I was just a little cat at the time. I worked in a studio called Festival, which is owned by a guy named Rick Nizer, who passed on recently, and but I never got to work at like Kingsway, and I never got to work at like what's the other big guy's place down there? I forget, but yeah, I could barely afford to record it all when I lived in New Orleans.
Yeah, we almost got to do an album at Kingsway, and then we got our legs swept out from under us by a realignment at the label we were on. I was really stoked. Like, we did a tour and like got to walk through the studio and see how the control room was just right in the middle of the biggest room in the building, and the drums were visible, like they were right there, and it looked like a really good environment, and I was really stoked to record there, and then like the money just never came through. It was a real tragedy.
Who was going to record, Daniel or Trina or someone?
I think we were maybe going to work with Daniel. I at the time I was probably 24. I was really young and didn't really understand until later what the relationship with picking the right sort of person to run the control room. So when we were looking at Kingsway, we were like, whoever is going to run the session is going to run the session, but this is such a cool room and a cool town, and one of our guys grew up there, so yeah.
Yeah. I have a funny story about that if you want to hear it.
Of course.
I was in rehab for a while, a long time ago, and I was in rehab with Shannon Hoon, the singer from
Blind Melon.
Yeah, Blind Melon. And so me and Shannon were roommates for months, right?
Oh, man.
I got to know him really well, and he was a sweetheart. I really loved him. A really nice guy, and I was supposed to work on his solo record, blah, blah, blah. Never happened. He died. But Shannon told me Shannon had just come from recording their second record, and they had done it at Kingsway, but it wasn't with Daniel. It was with some other producer. So Daniel wasn't around. So Shannon got into all kinds of trouble when he was in New Orleans. Like, he ended up in the back of a police car more than once, I think. Anyways, I don't really know the stories behind the police car stories, but I do know the story Shannon told me, which was later corroborated by a separate source. So I know it to be true. Shannon, you could stay at Kingsway if you wanted to, kind of like Steve Albini. And so Shannon had opted to stay there. And so, after everyone went to bed, Shannon, of course, stayed up really late, getting super loaded, I'm sure, because that's what he liked to do. God bless him. And so one night, I guess he went into Daniel's study, or Daniel's room where he kept his Grammys, and he unscrewed one of the Grammy caps, like one of the gramophone horns will unscrew from the statue.
Yeah.
And he placed it between his butt cheeks. As if it looked like he had inserted the whole statue into his ass, And then he had someone take a Polaroid picture, and he left it somewhere in Daniel's desk. That's the story, right?
Oh my God!
I don't know if it's true, but I heard some corroborating, account from a different engineer that worked there that implied that it might have been true.
It seems like Kingsway was kind of a nexus for a lot of bad behavior. Like, I've heard some Afghan Whig stories.
Well, it was haunted.
Tell me about that.
It was there. I don't know anything about it other than the fact that it was known to be haunted. So, if you're going to a known haunted studio, you're probably going to end up with some weird behavior, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think that was out of character for Shannon. I only knew him for about 3 months, but that seemed to be kind of like standard jokester Shannon Hoon behavior. What did the Afghan Whigs do there?
Oh, man. So I can't substantiate any of this, but I've seen it talked about in several places. But, yeah, it just got out of hand there. Someone apparently took a shit in a linen closet while they were there out of frustration, something that was happening, and the Afghan Whigs did not finish their record at Kingsway.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That I've never heard before. A lot of ass play. Kingsway invited a lot of ass play.
Yeah, we just call it Buttway now. So, yeah. One of the things that I really, 5/8 was, we were touring a bunch of studios trying to figure out where we're going to make our next record. One of the things that I remember most distinctly about Kingsway was that there was this hot tub on a patio, kind of in this sort of grotto, and like these ancient French Quarter buildings. That might not have been French Quarter; it might have been Market District. But anyway, there was this like hot tub and a banana palm that just sort of hung over the hot tub, and they would, like, whenever it got too cold, they would just fire up the hot tub to keep the bananas safe. So they had like this ripe banana generator out there, and that was like like banana daiquiris were like a big part of what you lived on at Kingsway. So it just seemed like a really like cool place to make a record. But it sounds like a lot of people just spun the fuck out when they were there.
Yeah, I've never heard that about any of Daniel's other places. Like, Daniel's always got some cool spot he's turned into a recording studio. I've never heard any other ass play stories from any other room. So it must have just been that. Must have been that room.
So, Before we started recording, you were talking about how you're from a family of where your great grandfather immigrated to New York from Russia, and you grew up just north of the city in Westchester County. But tell me a little bit about your family of origin.
Oh, well, my dad was a lawyer, and my mom was a nurse, and they met in Philadelphia at Penn, University.
Yeah.
And then they settled in a town called Rye, which is right above New York City. It's an incredibly expensive place to live. Like hardly anybody I know who came from there can live there now, but it was a really beautiful little kind of seaside New York town that I always thought sucked until I left, and then I realized how really nice it was.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then divorce. My parents were divorced when I was a kid, and my family's full of addiction and recovery, luckily. And yeah, I mean, we're pretty boring, like New Englanders. I did have a great uncle who was in the music business who did really well. But it was way before I got into the music business. Like when I got into the music business, he had already been retired like for 20 years. So like there wasn't any like connection crossover. But every once in a while I'd run into somebody and they'd say, "Oh, Charlie Grean. Yeah, I worked with him on blah, blah, blah." My great uncle Charlie Grean was, he was a bass player for Glenn Miller. Then he was an arranger, and then he was a producer. Then he was an A&R guy. He was a label boss for a while. He worked with, he worked with Leonard Nimoy on all his records.
Oh, yeah?
Which is kind of feather in the cap. Yeah, him and Leonard Nimoy were apparently very close. I never got to meet Leonard Nimoy, but he worked with Merv Griffin when Merv Griffin was a singer, Dinah Shore when Dinah Shore was a singer. The biggest thing that my great uncle did was he arranged the strings for Nat King Cole's Christmas song, Chestnuts Roasting, the most famous one. My great uncle did the string section, which is actually a very nice arrangement. And that's it. My father was a golfer and liked to go to the country club, and they were very preppy. Really kind of, my family was very preppy. Like we had a sheepdog and everything, like we were like preppy New York stereotypes, basically.
Yeah.
But not anymore. Now they're all. My dad's in Florida. My mother's in Vermont. My brother's still here, and they're not preppy anymore. And we don't have sheepdogs anymore. So.
How old were you when your parents divorced?
I was in third grade, and it really fucked me up. If you want to talk about anxiety, when my parents got divorced, it was really ugly, horrible, yelly kind of divorce, and I ended up having to go to a psychiatrist, and they ended up putting me on Valium when I was in third grade, which is really, I mean, I guess, it must have been about 1975, and at that time Valium was like a wonder drug, I think. They just thought it was like this amazing thing they gave to you if you had the slightest amount of anxiety. So anyways, they put me on Valium when I was in third grade, and pretty quickly I realized that if I said the right words to my mother, she would give me one, and then I would like go watch the Brady Bunch reruns for like an hour and a half and just chill out. So third grade, I'm already figuring out how to work people for pills. So
man,
there's two important takeaways there. One is that I had this anxiety that was real enough, and it was real. Like I didn't go to school for a while because of my social whatever the fuck was going on. I just couldn't handle it. So I had anxiety that was real, and it was, impeding my life. And at the same time, he gave me Valium for it, which I don't think was a great idea. And then the third thing is I learned that there was like this external thing that I could put into my body that would change my state of mind almost immediately. I learned that in third grade, which I don't think is a great thing to teach children in third grade.
No,
so anyway, and I mean, it's not his fault I had anxiety. I had it before I met the doctor. I think he really kind of helped me learn about fucking, medication abuse. Yeah. And that's a weird thing to learn when you're in the third grade. And, the problem that I've had my whole life with substance abuse is basically I have the anxiety that showed up in third grade was a thing that was just going to be with me for the rest of my life. There wasn't that much I could do about it. And, of course, I had to go through a lot of bouts with benzos because that's what they give to anxiety people.
Right.
And I had to go through that a few times in order to realize that the benzos actually make anxiety worse if you take too many of them, So, I've had panic attacks before that were brought on by, I believe, taking too many benzos. Like, it makes it worse.
Yeah.
And then when you try to get off the benzos, you've got like a year of just horrible mood swings.
Yeah.
So I learned that, I'm 53 now, so I learned that lesson 3 different times.
Oh, God.
The problem is that the symptoms of the long-term detox from benzos kind of apes why you took the benzos. You know what I mean? Like, it's like your anxiety gets worse, your mood swings get worse, your depression gets worse when you quit the benzos. And it gets so bad, 6 months later, you're like, wow, I really should take some benzos because this is exactly why they gave me the benzos. But the benzo kick that's making you want it, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
It's terrible. It's a bad merry-go-round.
How long you got prescribed Valium in third grade? How long was that prescription? Like, were you still doing that in high school, or was that just a couple of years?
Oh no, I don't remember, to tell you the truth. Like, when they went away, it wasn't that long though. It was probably like a year. It was, and it was a very small amount because I was a kid, and my mother's a nurse, so she wasn't stupid. She wasn't like blindly just giving me these things like Flintstones. She was doling them out very, very, judiciously and like a RN should. So I don't know how long it lasted. And it's not like I had them in my room and I was like hiding them or anything. But it was a lesson learned. You know what I mean, Patrick? Like, I carried that lesson forward, into my next phase of self-medicating. Like I had learned the lesson, and so when we got to like high school and we got to pot and stuff like that, it was, I was like, oh yeah, here's another external substance that seems to take away my anxiety for a while. Yeah. You know what I mean?
So you got to New Orleans like with a pretty good, healthy appetite for mood or mind altering substances, I'm guessing.
Oh, it was really, I'll tell you what. When I was in high school, I was like a total drug dealer, right? I was like the drug dealer in the school, like I'm talking about selling like grams of pot, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Not like pounds.
Right.
Like grams of pot, eighths of pot, whatever. But I was the guy. So I always had money. My parents didn't give me any money, but I always had money, and I always had weed, and I was also very popular. But when I went to New Orleans to go to college, I realized, okay, I'm not going to keep selling drugs in New Orleans. That just sounds like a recipe for getting shot. You know what I mean? It's like going to this little tiny suburban town where you know everyone and you only sell pot to your friends, and then you try to go sell pot in New Orleans, and then you end up with the mafia on your back or something. So I was smart enough to go like, forget it. I'm not going to sell drugs anymore in New Orleans. I'm just going to go to college and play guitar and do what I do. And so within like a few weeks, I was broke. I was at college, and I was broke, and I had no weed, and I had no money to go party. And, my parents did not give me money for that kind of shit. They just paid the tuition and said, you're on your own. And so it was a total bummer. It was a huge life fucking change because I've been the pot dealer at high school for like 4 years, and now I was just broke and unpopular and didn't have any weed. So, but anyway, so yeah, that's my drug dealing history.
Yeah.
But I was smart enough to go like, nah, this isn't going to work down here. I'm going to get my head stomped.
Yeah. Best case scenario is you get your head stomped.
Right, best case, right, exactly. Like, lucky to just get a head stomping.
Yeah. And when did music come into your life? Like, when did you start playing guitar?
I've always had obsessions. It's probably part of my addict wiring, where I get into something and I get really into it. So, the first thing I got into really heavily was photography, and I was really into it. And I'm like, like in 7th grade or 6th grade, I had my own dark room kind of in the basement. And I was really into it. And then for a couple of years, I was really like, I'm a photographer. And I was okay at it. And then the guitar thing came along, and the photography thing just went fucking out the window immediately. It was like, wow, bam. So the way it worked for me was somebody came over to my house. My brother's friend came over one night with a mandolin that he had found somewhere, and he wanted to sell it so that he could buy a case of beer. And I gave him $20 for the mandolin so he could buy a case of Heineken. That's how much Heineken was back then.
Yeah.
And I started playing this thing. It was the first string instrument I ever had. And, it kind of sucked because it was a mandolin. It was hard to play. And
yeah,
you definitely, you can't jam Freebird on the mandolin very well. So, and what happened was I met these two guys. One was a bass player, one was a guitar player, and they're twins from my high school that summer that I got the mandolin. And they had already started playing actual instruments. Like one was playing bass and one was playing guitar. And the guitar player guy was really good. I mean, he was like the kid in town that everybody would be like, wow. And so I played rhythm mandolin, and he played lead guitar, and the bass player played bass, and then we got a drummer. And I did that for like 6 months, and I got an amp and a pickup for my mandolin, and I was actually like the mandolin rhythm guy with his amp and everything. And I just realized eventually how limiting it was and how much fun the guitar guy was having. Like, he had distortion and stuff, that you couldn't put on a mandolin. So I got a shitty electric guitar thereafter, and I actually took my brother's electric guitar. You know how that used to happen. Like your sibling would have an instrument and not play it, and eventually you might liberate it. So I liberated my brother's electric guitar, and my friend Jonathan taught me how to, some chords and shit, and that's how I started. And it was much better than the mandolin because you could, you can plug it into a Marshall and you could rock out with it, even just knowing a few chords.
It's so funny. So the whole talking about obsessions, like you took this mandolin like way further than a normal human being would have. Like normally would have been like, well, I got this mandolin, I'm going to pawn it, but like you dove in and learned mandolin.
Kind of, yeah, but I tried. Yeah, I tried really hard. I took lessons. It was really weird. I would take my mandolin to my lesson lady, who was really a guitar player, but she taught mandolin. And I would bring her these rock songs, and I go, "You teach me how to play Whole Lotta Love on this?" And she would just look at me like, like here I got a Zeppelin record, and I'm like, "Teach me how to play this," and it's a mandolin. It doesn't have an open E.
Right.
I'm not gonna ever play that song right.
Well, you were a big Deadhead in high school, right?
When I was a kid, there wasn't really any other music other than Southern rock and the Grateful Dead. That's basically what our whole lives revolved around in my town. So the first songs we learned were Sweet Home Alabama. That was the first song everybody learned because it was 3 chords. And or 4, I guess, if you want to argue. Did you know that there's a really big argument on the internet about Sweet Home Alabama and what key the piano solo's in?
I did not know that.
Yeah, piano players will argue about what key the Sweet Home Alabama piano solo's in, because apparently there's arguments to be made for different modes. I don't know.
Sure.
I mean, I know what modes are, but I don't get into it. Anyways, so in my town, it was basically Leonard Skinner, Allman Brothers, Charlie Daniels, all that kind of Marshall Tucker. We loved that shit for some reason. I guess New York kids eating up the Southern.
I mean, we loved it down here too. Like there was no daylight between any of that and Led Zeppelin and
yeah, right.
Yeah, it was all part of just being a musician, a rocker in Georgia, for sure.
Right. And then, so anyways, and the Grateful Dead was, like, my town was a huge Grateful Dead head town. And I played in a band, actually, that just played a lot of Grateful Dead and Allman Brothers. And, you know, nowadays they call it a dead band or a tribute band. But at the time, we just thought it was like, what else were we going to play? We're going to play... We started with Leonard Skinner, and then we kind of graduated to Allman Brothers, and then we got into the Grateful Dead eventually, too. But, like, you know, now there's a whole industry running off of Grateful Dead tributes, and there's tons of them. There are, especially around here. There's just so many of them, and they're very good and everything. I don't go to see them, but I think that they're good at doing the Grateful Dead thing. So it's like this industry, but at the time when we were kids, we didn't think about it like, you know, we're going to start a Grateful Dead tribute band. We just thought, like, this is just what we play. We play Allman Brothers, and we play Grateful Dead, and we play, you know, we just like to jam, basically. And it was what was around. And
so how did that set of sensibilities, like, when you carry them down to Tulane to study music in an academic setting, like, was there a collision there, or did it just kind of dovetail? Like, what was that experience like?
I didn't get much out of my academic musical studies other than really, really, really dry theory stuff.
Yeah.
Tulane Tulane didn't even have a jazz department, I don't think. Yeah, they didn't. They had a classical department. Tulane didn't have a good music school. But what Tulane had was in New Orleans, which was its own kind of music school.
Well, my understanding is that a lot of the jazz stuff kind of orbits around UNO more than Tulane.
Well, yeah, it's because Ellis Marsalis was there for years. But you know what I learned. I'll tell you a funny story about New Orleans and music and me. I went down there, and the very first couple months I was there, I met this guy named Alex Gatto. And I remember sitting in this guy's house, big, beautiful, rundown, old, like, Garden District mansion, like an Anne Rice setting. And we're sitting in this kid's house, and he's got this shitty record player, and he says to me, "Have you ever heard the Meters?" And I was like, "No, I'd never heard the Meters." It was like, you know, like, where would I have heard the Meters?
Right.
And he pulled it out, and he played Sissy Strut, and I was just, that was it. I wasn't a deadhead anymore. I was like, okay. I'm not a deadhead anymore.
Yeah.
This is the new thing for me for a long time, and it was for a long time.
You and I have talked about how much I love that New Orleans funk stuff. Like, it's one of my favorite things.
If you're a drummer, you can't not love it. It's so fucking, it's like catnip, right?
I mean, but the guitar parts are amazing too.
Well, the thing I learned from the Meters was just to be, you know, at times it's better to just play nothing. You know what I mean? Like, in the Grateful Dead world, everybody's playing something almost all the time. It might be something very light and small and tiny, but, like, they're all kind of up there clonking away. And it all meshes together, and everyone loves it, and it's magic. But, like, the Meters, like, there were these substantial... There was, like, a whole measure where, like, the guitar wouldn't play. And you'd be like, what? And there'd be, like, a keyboard fill there that was part of the melody or the head or whatever. It was just very judicious and very minimalist. And I was, like, really, like, wow, that's neat. And then plus all the funky licks and just the drumming. And it was just, like, you know, it was like catnip to me. I heard it, and I was just, like, hooked right away.
Yeah.
And it was cool because in New Orleans, you could actually hang out with those cats. You know what I mean? Like, I ended up playing in a bar called Benny's Bar on Allen Street forever, right? I played there, like, 3 nights a week for, you know, like, years. And that bar is literally a block from Art Neville's house. He lived on Valence. And Charles Neville lived across the street on Valence, about a block up from that bar. And then Cyril Neville lived, you know what I mean? Like, they all fucking lived on Valence Street. So you could play this, even as a white dude from New York, you could play this bar, Benny's, which was the funkiest, like, crappiest little neighborhood dive. Like, it even had, like studs showing in the wall. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was held together with chicken wire. And you played when I first started playing at Benny's, they had some kind of funky liquor license where, like, this is how you drank at Benny's. You went to the bar, and you said, I'll have a Bacardi and Coke. And Benny sold you a pint of Bacardi and a glass of ice and a Coke. And you took it back to your thing, and you mixed your own drinks. Because he had a packaged liquor license, right?
Right.
So anyways, that's the kind of place it was. And later on, years later after I left, I think they all went to jail. I think they were involved in some kind of cocaine ring. But I don't know, that's your thing. But anyways,
our hang in New Orleans was the Saturn Bar.
Oh, yeah, the Saturn Bar was great, too. But,
yeah.
Benny's was this place that you only went to if you were like a local, or if you were a college kid and somehow some hip friend of yours dragged you there. You know, like it was way uptown. And it wasn't in like a party area. It was in this really weird, it was in the 13th Ward? Yeah, 13th Ward, kind of a black neighborhood. It actually was a little bit scary, and that was one of the great things about it. But anyways, my point was, you go to New Orleans and you fall in love with the Meters, and like if you want to, you can go talk to fucking Art Neville. You can go talk to Charles Neville. You can jam with them. If you hang around their neighborhood long enough, they'll walk in one night and play. And that was beautiful. Like you can't do that anywhere else. Like if you went to let's say you went to maybe you could. I mean, maybe you could move to Athens and eventually meet Michael Stipe. I don't know. You know more about that than I would, but
yeah, I mean, those guys are in the bars, but it's also like different members of that band are more approachable than others. Some of those dudes really like their privacy. But like I've been playing with Mike Mills off and on for about 5 or 6 years now, and he's the most approachable, easygoing guy. But it's this sort of unspoken, like, don't abuse it. Like don't get in people's personal space. Don't interrupt conversations. Don't loom over the table like a buzzard if you want to just say hi. Like, but also they're here so much. Like they're out seeing shows and having a drink or whatever so much that the novelty wears off. Like at some point, you don't wave to Andy and Barney and Mayberry anymore because you just see them all the time,
Right, exactly.
That's the joke about Athens. It's Mayberry LSD.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Well, that's a lot like New Orleans too. But like for example, in LA, there's this kind of curtain between the talent and the fans.
Yeah.
That always exists. Like, if you see Slash out somewhere, you just don't go up to him. You know what I mean? He probably has a bodyguard or something. You know what I mean?
Right.
They like to keep this kind of, moat between them and the unwashed masses. But like, in a place like New Orleans, there wasn't any moat. You could just walk up to people and like, Earl King would hang out. You know who Earl King is?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So Earl King, it was a known thing for years that Earl King would be at the Tasty Donuts on Britannia every day between like 11 and 2 or something. Earl King would be there drinking coffee, eating donut. And you could go and talk to Earl King if you went to the fucking Tasty Donuts any day of the week, apparently.
But one of the things you said about New Orleans at that time was that it could be scary. And that's what I remember about New Orleans in the 90s. Like, you'd be hanging at the Saturn Bar and you'd meet like an art student from Tulane named Desiree, and you'd be having a conversation and find out that like, oh yeah, I carry a Browning high power 9mm. That's my sort of piece of choice. Like everybody was packing, like townie girls, poet boys with little notebooks that they would write ideas in, but they'd also have like a 45. Like it was the strangest thing.
Doug Grean too. Doug Grean had a 38 Ruger snub nose that he carried around New Orleans.
Yeah, I mean it was just part of life,
I'll tell you a story about that actually. My mother moved from New York to New Orleans while I was there. It was a giant tragedy because my mother's nuts, right? And she's not going to hear this now, so I don't have to worry about it. She moved from New York to Louisiana and just made my life hell for a few years. But anyways, when she was first moving there, I was working at this big college bar, and every big bar has what they call a detail on the weekends in New Orleans, which is a cop. They pay a cop to stand at the door in his full regalia with weapon and just be the detail security-wise,
Yeah.
So I was a bouncer at this bar, right? So I was a bouncer, and then I had these cops that worked with me every weekend, and so I got to know them really well. And so my mother's moving to New Orleans, and I said to the cop, I said, hey, my mom's moving to New Orleans, and she's coming from, the suburbs, and she's really worried about, crime and whatnot. What should she do? And he just looked at me, and he just said, without blinking, without any irony, he said, yo, she should get a gun. And I'm this kid from New York, and I'm like, a gun? Really? I'm like, yeah, she should get a gun. And I was like, okay. And then he goes, and she should carry it with her everywhere she goes. I go, okay. So that's your advice to me for my mom, is for her to get a pistol and carry it. And he was not kidding around. He wasn't kidding around.
No,
and then another time, at the same bar, another time, different cop. We're at the door of the bar. It's a very crowded night, and there's some cop activity down the block. You can see, lights. And he walks down there, and he comes back 10 minutes later. And I said to him, what happened? And he goes, oh, there was a shootout. And I said, what happened? And he goes, the good guy won. So apparently some New Orleanian with their pistol shot the bad guy, whoever the bad guy was. And the cop was just like, yeah, there's a shootout. Good guy won. I couldn't believe it. I was shocked. But I also bought a gun.
Yeah. So you're in New Orleans, you're playing music, you're working as a bouncer. Did you finish school at Tulane, or did you just say fuck this and just become a New Orleanian?
I just failed out a couple times. I actually, in the middle of that, I went to engineering school in New York for 6 months because my parents were come home for a little while. And I went to the SUNY Purchase, which is the State University of New York Purchase, which is... weirdly, it's right by my town where I grew up, and it also has a very good acting, and now they have a very good music program. So back then, they had just started their studio engineering program, and so I went to that. I actually went there for a year. So I took a year off from New Orleans, went to studio engineering school at Purchase, but, we didn't, I learned a lot. I definitely did, and I remember the professor, and I talked to him on Facebook and all this stuff, but, we just didn't have much. It was a new program. We had a 1-inch, 16-track TAC deck, and we had a small console, and then we had some outboard gear. And then so that was in one classroom, and they had just jackhammered a hole through the wall into another classroom, and they had run a snake. And that was the live room. So it wasn't really, they hadn't built, now they have a beautiful fucking studio. I'm sure I don't even know what they have there now, but I'm sure it's gorgeous. But back in the day, they had just talked the admin into letting them run this studio department. I'm talking about 1985 or 86. So
Yeah.
I tell you, I remember, do you remember the Ensoniq Mirage?
Yeah.
Do you remember that keyboard?
Yeah, yeah.
The reason why you remember it is because it was the first sampler that came out that was affordable. And so I remember the day we got our sampler. The first sampler was a huge deal. We were all like, oh my God, now we can go run around the building sampling noises.
Right. Exactly what we did. My friend Michelle Latta got one, and we just popped a balloon for a snare sound and stuff,
Right. And that was so you remember. So it was a big thing in the mid 80s when that came out. Yeah. Everybody was like, damn. So I went there for a year, but I learned about MIDI for the first time, which is good, and that played a role in my life. But there was also just other stuff. There was this great professor named James McElwine, who was a jazz saxophone player guy, really hip kind of cat,
Yeah.
And he ran the whole thing. And I remember hearing stories from him. I remember he told a story one time in class about a guy who had moved a few times, and he didn't tell BMI or ASCAP that he was moving, and so he had a $10,000 check waiting for him for 5 years. He told this story about it in class, and 20 years later, the same thing happened to me. I got divorced. The first time I got divorced, I moved into this new house. I forgot to tell BMI. It was a year later, and I was broke, and I was scrambling for money, and I found out they were holding a $7,000 check for me. And I ended up, so after that happened, years later, I found a guy on Facebook, and I sent him a long letter just saying, remember the story about the BMI guy and his royalties and moving? And I said, yeah, I did the same fucking exact thing. Apparently I wasn't listening that day.
Yeah, man.
Same thing.
It just drops into my account now, but it ain't $7,000. I'll tell you that right now.
That check came because of I had just put out the big record. It wasn't a big record, but I just put out the Scott Weiland solo record.
Yeah.
So that was like the first year that came out. That was the royalty for that. So that was my biggest royalty year. So I don't get $7,000 checks every year. Don't get me wrong, but that was my heyday, basically. If you want to talk in terms of life history, that was like, that was when I was on the football team, senior high, scoring all the football touchdowns.
Right, sure. What sort of precipitated the decision to leave New Orleans to go to Los Angeles?
Oh, it was complete and total geographic. Like I what happened? I got robbed a few times. I got a bunch of gear stolen. My band was on a break. So we weren't making any money. We were on like a 2-month break.
What band was that?
And just this band I had in New Orleans called, it was a cover band. It was just a full-on fraternity sorority band.
Yeah.
But, we were it was summertime, so there were none of those gigs. It was weird. We had a booking, I was in this cover band in New Orleans, and we had a booking agency out of Atlanta called Network. Huh. And they booked us all over the South, only at fraternities and sorority houses. It was that kind of thing. And we gigged a lot, and they made us a lot of money. Anyways, we're on a hiatus from that thing, and that was like my moneymaker. Then I got robbed, and all this bullshit happened. And my father had moved to California to start this ridiculous company that he started. And he had said to me, like the month before, he had said, come to California, I'll give you a job, my new company. And so after the robbery and all that, I called him up and I said, hey, remember you said you give me a job at the new company? Blah, 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 blah. Let me go out there. And so he sent me $500 and I moved to California. So it was basically like all kinds of bad shit happened. And I geographicked out to LA just because that's where my family had moved to. And I went out there to work for this company that my father had at the time. And when I got out there, he took one look at me and he just said, yeah, you can't work at the company.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Like I had really long hair and a beard, and I was just really a big time, like just guitar playing stoner kind of, knucklehead. And he just looked at me and said, yeah, I don't think that. So that was actually a blessing. I was mad at him for years, Patrick. Like that was big time fifth step shit right there.
Yeah.
And but we did that. We did all that fourth and fifth, and we talked it all out. We're good now. But at the time, I was pissed.
Yeah.
And for years, I was resentful. But that's when I said, okay, fuck it, I'm going to go into the studio business. And I got an internship at a studio in Burbank. That's not there anymore, but it was a cool studio in Burbank. The thing that made it the coolest was that it had the Dark Side of the Moon Neve console in it. So,
man,
the guy that owned this place, a guy named Steve Thompson, and it's not Steve Thompson, the famous producer. It's a different Steve Thompson. So I don't want anyone to get that confused. There's a Steve Thompson who's done a lot of records, but then there was this other guy from Canada named Steve Thompson who owned this place, the Clubhouse, and Steve Thompson, who owned this Neve, he ended up getting run out of L.A. on a rail a couple of years later. But anyways, that's a different story. He was kind of a fuck up. But at the studio, they had this beautiful, custom-made, like U-shaped Neve that was the Neve that they used to track Dark Side of the Moon. And this guy, Steve, had bought this Neve, probably this. I'm talking about 1993, so he probably bought it in the early 80s for nothing, And he also bought its sister console that came out of BBC. I don't know. There was another Neve that was made around the same time that was the sister console of this Neve, and he had also bought that. So this guy was basically in Neve heaven. Like, he had a storage room that was just stacked with modules.
Wow.
That I used to have to go into to like go, like clean things and shit when I was an intern.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was nice. So instead of going into this fucking business that my father had tried to get into, which failed eventually, I made the decision to go into the studio business, like for real, kind of like in LA, and go and jump in and become a intern, and then you become a runner, and then you become a second engineer if you're lucky. I decided to start that. And that was good because I went to work for this guy, Steve, and I worked for them for 8 months. I basically lived in the studio, which is kind of one of the things you do sometimes when you're an intern. That was kind of like the exchange was, here's this apartment you can live in, but you work for me 24 hours a day.
Right. It's like the Prince situation. It's like living at Paisley Park. You're always on call.
Yeah. Not as weird as Prince, I'm sure, but,
yeah.
Also not as cool. But I learned a lot. Like, I watched a lot of real producer engineers do real recordings and really learned a lot. But not, the other thing that we did while we were at Steve's was Steve was into making these 24-track recording systems that were all based on Elco multi-pin connectors. You know those things?
No.
Well, EDAC Elco is a connector. It's like a gray block at the end of a big 24-channel or 32-channel snake, right?
Right.
And so it just you can have 24 or 32 or 16 microphone cables all on this one block, right?
Right.
And it just screws into the female version. And so basically, Steve had this idea where he's like, I'm going to have a patch bay that has all Elcos on the back. I'm going to have a series of Elco cables, and then Elcos on the back of the console, Elcos on the back of the effects rack, Elcos on the back of the tape deck. And so everything will just plug together with these giant modular cables, and we can put it together in a few hours. So Steve, basically what I did for the first few months with Steve was sit in a room and solder and crimp and make Elco cables.
Yeah.
For hours. And I mean, like 16 hours a day at least. Me and 3 other guys just made Elcos. So we made a system, the system that we used to record the first Counting Crows record, August and Everything After.
Yeah.
That was a Steve Thompson system that I helped build, and I helped install it into the mansion that they recorded in. I'll tell you a funny story about that. So we have this really modular, cool system that we put into this mansion, and so because we're using these big EDAC Elco cables with Mangami snakes, there's not a lot of cabling. It's very neat, even though we've put this into this mansion kind of ad hoc.
Yeah.
And so the first day, the producer comes, and it's T-Bone.
Yeah.
T-Bone Burnett, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And T-Bone walks in, and he looks around, and he goes, "Where's all the cables?" and I say it's all modular. It's all EDAC multi-pins. They're back there. You just don't. They're just not everywhere like usual. And he goes, "I want to see cables. I'm coming back tomorrow. I want there to be cables everywhere." And he left.
So what? What do? You just run a bunch of dead cables and?
Yeah, we just ran a bunch of microphone cables around and tried to just kind of, I don't know, messy it up a little bit, because we were trying to make it really neat because my boss Steve was trying to sell these systems to other people. We made the next system that we made, we installed in Perry Farrell's garage, and they made the first Porno for Pyros record on this system. So these systems actually worked.
Yeah, clearly.
Yeah, they actually worked, and hit records were made through them. But there was a bunch of monkeys in the back room soldering for like a year, and that was me.
Yeah.
But the good thing about it is that I really learned signal flow. Like, I really learned signal flow because I was literally making the cables. So like, when I came out of studio engineering school, I didn't quite understand signal flow. I don't know if they, like I said, it was a new engineering school, so I don't know if they had that class together yet or what. But when I went to work for Steve making these systems, like, I really understood signal flow like the back of my hand, which was really a blessing. And then I also had really, really good soldering skills when I left there. So,
yeah,
I'll tell you what, I probably wouldn't be in the business if it wasn't for my soldering skills, because I couldn't fucking afford to, buy everything pre-loomed and pre-soldered. Like, people do that nowadays. Like, I've been to kids' studios, and I say kids, I say 30-year-old dude studios, where they've got these things in their racks, and I'll go, oh, that's nice, you make that? No, I bought that. I custom ordered that. Can you imagine how much that costs? Like,
yeah,
to custom order? I mean, I know how much it costs. Thousands
of dollars, yeah.
When I next door to the room I'm in now is the garage where I have most of the shit I shipped out here that I'm slowly commissioning into my new studio, and most of it's cables. Like when my brother saw what came out of the truck that I shipped here, because it was mostly cables, and I was like, yeah, that's what do you fucking think a studio is? Like, a studio is like $5,000 worth of gear and $30,000 worth of cable.
I remember how pissed I was when I built my first room. Like, I got all the mics I wanted that I could afford, and all the outboard gear and a little console and all that, and then I was like, all right, I better get some fucking cables. And I went to B&H's website and opened a shopping cart and started dropping cables in it, and before long, man, there was fucking $2,500 worth of cables in there, and I was like, I don't want to spend $2,500 on cables. I want to spend $2,500 on a drum set. It was really frustrating.
Yeah, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. It goes on forever.
Oh yeah, no, all those cables are in a box in my garage now. I've still got every single one of them.
Right. So anyways, learning how to solder and make cables, and I actually even learned how to solder patch base, which is like the brain surgery of fucking soldering. But
yeah.
So it served me well, and to this day I still, like, I was just telling my nephew yesterday, I was like, because he's a guitar player and he's got all these broken cables, and I was like, so you got your box full of broken cables, right? And he's like, yeah. I was like, okay, we're going to order a pizza and have a fucking soldering party next week, and we're just going to sit down and fix cables, and I'll teach you how to solder right. Because if you're going to be in the studio business, you better know how to solder, or you better either have a trust fund or you know how to solder.
Yeah, the truth. That is the truth. So you're in Los Angeles. You've sort of established a beachhead in the studio system there, but you're working 20 hours a day at this point. Like, where's your head at? Like, are you partying at all? Are you like still self-medicating with weed?
When I was in the internship for 8 months, I wasn't really partying much because I was just working all the time, and the guys I worked with were all Canadians, right? They were all from Hamilton, which is the town that Daniel's from, and they all knew Daniel. Not that that has anything to do with this, but anyways, small world. But anyways, I was working at the studio that's populated completely by Canadians, and all they did was drink beer, and nobody smoked pot, and nobody did any kind of other drugs. And so I don't really drink beer. I'm not a beer drinker. So
yeah,
I wasn't sober. I was just kind of just hanging out there, just not doing much. But that was just a weird thing for me, because usually I do more than much.
Yeah.
But my addiction didn't start to blossom until I left the studio system for a while, and I worked at Alesis, which is a company that makes studio gear.
Yeah, I got a MIDI verb. I can like reach out and touch. I'm touching my MIDI verb right now.
Touch it for me.
Okay.
Anyways, I worked there for 5 years, and it was a good thing. I mean, it was all musicians and super cool people. It was a tough work environment because we were working on the ADAT at the time, and it broke so much that, like, basically, I was in product support, so I just basically had studio owners yelling at me all day long, basically. I mean, like, every day you'd have a guy call, like, twice a day and go, I just bought 4 ADATs, and I have a session starting today, and they're not working. And you go, well, what I would say to them is, I try to get their shit working, but in the back of my head, I'd be thinking, why did you just buy a whole new system yesterday, and then your first paying customer is coming today?
Yeah.
give yourself any time to test your fucking system. It's a brand new system. It's a modular system. It's fucking cheap as dirt. You should give yourself a week to run it before you fucking bring someone in to have a session.
Yeah.
Anyways, whatever. So, but
Yeah.
you know, I sympathize with these guys because they're like, you know, I have a band here right now, and my ADAT's Error 9, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So basically, I dealt with those guys for a long time, and it was a little tough because you know, basically every day, just phone call after phone call of guys like freaking out on you.
I've been there. I've been in support too. There's nothing like the guy who updates Mac OS right before the band walks in the door. That's always the guy that I want to just like reach through the phone and strangle.
Yeah, you know, I made that mistake too. I have totally done that, and you know, you learn the hard way about things like that. You know what I mean? Like, I remember the first time I did the whole OS update, and my whole entire studio stopped working. And I talked to a friend who's a very big software guy up north and up Northern California, and he said to me, "Hey, man, you only update your operating systems. There's something that you can't live without.
Right?
Like you don't need your update your OS for no reason if your system's stable."
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, I never thought of that. I just thought, you know, the best was the newest. And anyways, so because of that guy, I had a Pro Tools system running like Pro Tools 7.4 for like 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, it worked.
Because of that guy.
Just use it as a tape machine.
Never crashed. Oh my God, it was
rock solid. Yeah.
When I had to move on from 7.4, I was so sad. I was like, God damn it! But I was like literally forced to move on by you know, progress, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, so where were we? I've been working at Elisa's for a while, and it was good because I actually built an entire studio in my garage using, you know, like broken Elisa's gear that I bought for nickels on the dollar.
Right.
So it was a good means to an end, but I also my addiction kind of spiraled, and I've kind of bottomed out while I worked there. But I'll tell you what, they sent me to rehab, that company.
No shit.
And they paid the whole fucking bill.
Was this coke?
No, this is heroin, and or just opiates in general. And I remember my father thought he was going to have to pay the bill, and then the bill never came, and he was so relieved. And I said, well, that's, you know, and I was so embarrassed to go to rehab. You know, when I went back to work, I was really kind of, you know, very embarrassed about it. And afterwards, I found out that like a third of the people there had been, you know, sent to rehab. And like, 15% of them were going to meetings, and like there was a huge like community of, you know, recovery in this corporation that I didn't even know about, because of course it's all musicians. You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
The only people that worked at Elisa's that weren't musicians were like, there was a few accountants that worked there that weren't actually like guitar players, but everyone else in the whole fucking company had like stories about their hair metal band getting signed and dropped and blah, blah, blah.
How did you get turned on to dope?
Oh, you know, it's funny. It's, I have addictive, obsessive personality.
Yeah.
I have anxiety and depression, like out the wazoo, that I struggle with constantly, and I'm still struggling with it. The way I got onto the heroin was, I liked pills a lot, just as a recreational vehicle, you know, opiate pills, but I never was like addicted to them. I was, you know, because you just get them once in a while, you know, it wasn't like a kind of thing you can get them all the time.
Yeah.
Anyways, what happened to me was I had an accident, and I had to have a big operation on my finger on my right hand. It was I almost lost a finger, and they were able to put this finger back together. It was like 8 hours of microvascular surgery and nerve surgery, and so they saved my finger. But you know, I was in the hospital for like 3 days, and they're giving you morphine every 4 hours or whatever. You know, they're giving you intravenous painkillers, and you're really happy about it. And then when they discharge you from this particular hospital in California, it's the county hospital. And even back in 1995, they're very stingy with the meds. So they sent me home with like 20 Vicodin, or not 20, 20 Tylenol 3. Like, you know, and I looked at them and I laughed. I was like, 20 Tylenol 3? What the fuck? And it just so happened that, like, you know, the next day, I was at my pot dealer's house, and I ran into my first heroin dealer. You know what I mean? You know how it happened. Like, I was basically in a sleazy sleazy, like, apartment in Hollywood, right? Like, right near fucking the Chinese theater, some dingy, crappy, pothead's house. And I'm sitting there at the table buying weed, and this guy sits down and he pulls out a bunch of heroin. And that was basically how it happened. And my junkie mind just said, like, hey, that's the same thing as codeine. Let's grab some of that. So that's how it happened. And I remember, I remember the next day I was at Elise's, I was at work, and I had this guy's number in my pocket, like on a little piece of paper, and his name was Asia. What a great name for a fucking dope dealer, right?
Yeah.
This fucking guy named really sleazy, weird little fucking rocker dude named Asia, and I remember looking at his number, thinking to myself, I swear I had this thought. I thought, this is the edge of a cliff I'm holding in my hand, and I can either go over the cliff and call this guy, or I can throw this away. And guess what I did, Patrick?
You Thelma and Louise that motherfucker.
Exactly. So that was that was the big error on my part. But it doesn't really matter because, listen, I like, this is my personal take on addiction and recovery and meetings and stuff like that is, let's say you're sitting in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever, Cocaine Anonymous, and let's say there's 50 people there. 40 of them are there probably because they have mood disorders, meaning they have depression or anxiety, to the point where they had to self-medicate.
Yeah.
And then the self-medication, eventually you go over the cliff with the self-medication. It stops working and you keep going, or it causes all kinds of bad things to happen, or you just can't stop, or blah, blah, blah. So, my take on it is most people that end up in recovery did it because they had a mood disorder and they were self-medicating. And that was basically my whole trip. And it's still my trip. Like, I still struggle with the need to self-medicate and the need to try to manage my depression or my anxiety or both.
Well, me and a singer-songwriter from Nashville that I've known for years named Boo Ray had this conversation in episode 15.
I know Boo Ray.
You know Boo?
I know Boo. I fucked up, man. I could have worked with Boo. Like, he wanted to jam, and I never did, and I always regretted it. But I'm pretty sure I met Boo Ray from Michael Weiland, Scott Weiland's brother.
Yeah.
But, anyways, go ahead. Tell your story about Boo.
Well, Boo and I had the same conversation about prison, about how, unfortunately, we'd already turned the microphones off, but he's done some time, and we were talking about, like, when you're in prison and you look around, what do you think the percentage of people who were actually, like, criminals in there, what is the percentage of people who actually, like, really need to be in prison versus the number of people who have mood or substance abuse disorders or have committed crimes related to poverty,
right?
That could have been remediated and could have avoided the whole prison thing whatsoever if they'd done smart sentencing or some kind of pretrial diversion where they like got into treatment or something. And he was like, he's super country. He's like, wow, I don't know, man. I'm saying I'll be generous and say that it's probably only about 20%, probably 15, really. Like his whole take was, like, the vast majority of people in prison are there because it's profitable for somebody for them to be in prison. Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, there's a whole, like, weird inverse ratio between denying healthcare, denying mental health care, and stocking your privatized prison system. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, there's inverse ratio between that they seem to have figured. I'm sure that the bean counters, the math heads, have figured out how to ride that ratio for its most extreme profitability. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. Really, it's fucking. It's a crime. Yeah, it's a crime, and no, like they don't do that in Sweden, dude. They don't do that in Norway. They don't do that in Germany. They don't. I don't know what they don't mass produce mood disorders in order to incarcerate them for profit. They gave up on that model. Yeah. So your first sort of attempt to get sober happens while you're working at Elise's. And you're 25 at this point, 26?
I was 29. I was just about to turn 30, where I was, I had told myself I wouldn't be alive, anymore.
Yeah.
So, it was that kind of thing where it was like, I'm going to be 30 in about 9 months, and I've decided that I don't want to die. So I guess we're gonna have to address some issues if we want to move past 30. So I was 29. I was working at Elise's, and I did get sober. I stayed sober for 12 years or something.
Wow.
And I did the thing. I went to the meetings, and I had the sponsors, and I did the steps, and I still do that stuff, and I still think that shit works. It only works for certain, people. You have to have the right mindset. You got to be able to really get humble, which is, I think, a big problem for a lot of my artsy friends that don't take to it. But, and then, so I went to rehab in 95, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I got out and I stayed sober. And then a year later, my brother went to rehab, 96. And I was living near the rehab, and at this particular place, they invited you to come back. Like, they were like, come back to the evening meeting, come back to the Saturday night meeting, come back to the alumni meeting. Stop in anytime you like. So I lived nearby, and I was still kind of going there at least once a week and hanging out. And then my brother had to go, so I got him in there.
Yeah.
My brother goes to rehab, and I drop him off like in the evening, and then the next morning, I call him to make sure he's still there, that kind of thing.
Right,
and,
right.
And he tells me, he goes, "Yeah, I'm still here. He's feeling better. He's actually doing all right. Actually, he's pretty happy, amazingly." And but he tells me, he goes, "I got this roommate in the middle of the night who brought him in, this fucking nut. He's nuts, and he's got to be somebody, because they're treating him with kid gloves. Like, there's something up with this guy." But he didn't know who the guy was, because my brother's basically a deadhead.
Yeah.
He's not a rock and roller. And also, the dude had a big beard at the time, and it turned out to be Weiland, right? So Scott Weiland is my brother's roommate in rehab, and that's how I got to know Weiland the first time I met him. He had just come in. They had just finished mixing Tiny Music, right?
Yeah.
And he was such a mess during that recording. Like, if you listen to that record, I swear to God, I can hear cocaine in those vocals. I can hear heroin in those vocals. Like, I can hear the fucking crackle of a crack pipe in those vocals, because I know what he was up to during the making of that record. Yeah. I didn't know him then. I met him right after that, but I heard all the stories from everybody, like from the engineers and the band and him and everybody. Like, apparently he was in really horrible shape, and that's why the vocal delivery on that record, in my opinion, is really pretty rough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, so that's how so I'm a year sober, and I meet Scott. He's all fucked up and blah, blah. He's my brother's roommate. And that's how my relationship with that knucklehead happened. So it happened as a result of recovery.
Yeah.
Which is kind of weird. Even though Scott never was able to really get his recovery, we certainly went to a lot of meetings together. And I took him to rehab half a dozen times. I took him to rehab once in Tucson. So I had to go collect him from a crack house in Laurel Canyon, get him into a limo, convince him to get into the limo, and battle with him the whole way, and then take him to the airport, and then fly him to Arizona, and then get him in another limo and take him to Sierra, Tucson. And it took like an entire day just to get him from LA to Tucson, which is a 40-minute flight.
What is flying with his crazy person? You pull him out of a crack house and you got to fly from LAX to the airport.
Dude, listen, this is the best story. It takes me like hours to get him out of the crack house. Like, I have to keep knocking on the door, and I have to keep waiting outside, and finally I get him out of there. We're on our way to LAX, and anybody in LA who goes to LAX knows that just south of LAX there's an In-N-Out burger, right? Just like, it's the first thing when you're going north out of LAX. On the left, there's an In-N-Out burger. And so we're in this limo, and Scott says, "Pull into the In-N-Out burger." Because I watched the motherfucker take a hit of crack the size of Manhattan I've never seen a hit a crack this fucking big. Like, this guy took a rock the size of a snowball, stuck it in a pipe, and just honked it down. I had never seen anyone do anything like that. And then he gets out of the limo and throws everything in the trash, and he gets back in the limo. And 2 minutes later, we're in the security line, right? I mean, because we're that close to LAX. So we're in the security line. It's not very crowded that day. You know, there's like 6 different security kiosks or whatever. So when we get to the head of the line and you get to choose which kiosk you go, which like machine you go through, I choose one far away from him. So he's kind of on the other side of the room, and I'm going through security, and I'm watching him, and he is so high that he is moving in slow motion. Like, have you ever been so high that you're just so, like, in your own head that, like, you forgot how to move? Well, he was moving. He's literally moving in slow motion. He's, like, sweating an ocean. He's white as a ghost. And I'm thinking for sure we're going to get arrested or something. And so I'm with one security guy, and he doesn't know I'm with this guy. And I see the other security guys, and they're all watching him as he's going through. And they're laughing.
Oh, God.
They are laughing at this guy. They weren't going to arrest him. I mean, you know, if they had found a bunch of drugs on him, they would have had to have called the police. But he didn't have any drugs. He was just fucking totally acting like, I mean, if you were in the room with me, I could do it for you. Like, I do, like, this slow motion cocaine pantomime. That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
That I wish I could do. I wish I could do it for you. But anyways, yeah. So that's one story. And so, you know, then we get on the plane, and he starts drinking and whatnot, and he's relatively normal again within like an hour. And then we get to Arizona, and before we go to the rehab, he wants to go to a steakhouse. So he says to the driver, take us to the best steakhouse in Tucson. So we go there, and we post up there for like 4 hours, where I watch him drink copious amounts of expensive alcohol and drink and eat everything on the menu. And then after that, he says to the waiter, where are the whores at? You know, he wants to know where the hookers are. And the only reason he wants to know where the hookers are is because they know where the cocaine is. Yeah. And of course, the waiter at the Republican Steakhouse just looks at him with horror in his eyes. He's just like, I don't know where the hookers are, sir. Sorry. Anyway, so, you know, we got to Tucson at like 2 p.m. We didn't get to Sierra Tucson until midnight, because he just wanted to keep stopping, and like, just, you know, going to rehab is terrible. Nobody wants to go.
Yeah, it's like trying to put a cat in a bathtub. You know, they're gonna grab every towel and towel rack and shower curtain on the way into the bathtub. So
exactly. So it took. So I mean, I literally took him to rehab a dozen times. That was the worst one. That was the only one that involved flying. But the other ones were all just equally as bad. Took hours and hours and hours, and involved a lot of yelling. And the last time I took him to rehab, he stood in the lobby of this place called Los Encinas, which is where Dr. Drew is like the head of the department. Yeah. And it's not, Los Encinas is not the TV place. Los Encinas is really old. It's been there for years. It's like, you know, it's very well respected. And Drew is actually a real, you know, he's a really respected guy in that field, even though he's become this celebrity. So anyways, we're at Los Encinas, and we're in the lobby, and it's like a library. It's so quiet. You know, it's like a nunnery. It's so quiet in there. And he's just in there screaming at me, just like Trumpian fiction. Like he was telling everyone there that I had embezzled millions of dollars from our record company and blah, 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 and all this like bullshit, like just spewing craziness. And it's all insane because, I mean, basically, we never had any millions, ever. There were no millions to steal from anything. So anyways, we had a lot of interesting rehab delivery situations.
Hey, Crash and Ride would like to let you know about a new industry-wide initiative focused on mental health called Backline. Backline is a hub for artists, industry professionals, and their families to quickly and easily access mental health and wellness resources. Backline has partnered with leading support organizations and care providers to streamline access to services specifically geared towards the music industry. Go to www.backline.care to get the support that you need to thrive both on and off the road. The way that Backline works is you contact them via their website or their 800 number, and they will connect you with a caseworker. That caseworker will be familiar with resources in your area to get you the mental health care that you need. If you need to talk to a therapist, they can put you in touch with a therapist. If you need to talk to a psychiatrist and be evaluated for meds, they have a list of psychiatrists. They have resources for inpatient therapy. They can put you in touch with sober companions. If you need someone to travel with you while you're on the road and help you stay out of trouble, Backline is a really end-to-end comprehensive solution for people who are struggling in the music industry. Now, a little closer to home, if you're in the Athens, Georgia area and you're a musician struggling with anxiety and depression, you can contact Nucci Space at 706-227-1515 or go to nuci.org. That's nucci.org. Nucci Space is a nonprofit musicians resource focused on suicide prevention. Here's how Nucci's works. If you contact them and you say, hey, look, I'm in crisis, whether you're a musician or not, they'll connect you with resources in the Athens, Georgia area. If you're a musician, that health care will be subsidized. In my own case, I was able to see a counselor for $15 or $20 a session. If you're not a musician, they'll do their best to connect you with low-cost or sliding scale options for mental health care in Athens. Nucci Space provides a lot of resources for musicians in the Athens area. They have low-cost practice spaces. They have a gear sale where they're constantly selling secondhand gear. They've got a low-cost recording studio. They're really just an amazing asset to the Athens, Georgia music scene, but their primary mission is helping people who are depressed or anxious get better. Go to nuci.org, that's nucci.org, or call 706-227-1515. And finally, no matter where you are, if you're struggling with anxiety and depression and you're contemplating self-harm, you can always call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-TALK. It's 24/7. It's free. It's confidential. They have trained volunteers to help get you through your crisis and get you the help that you need. Call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255 or go to suicidepreventionlifeline.org.
And this had to have had a profound impact on your own sobriety, like this weird codependent thing where you're trying to keep this guy like between the lines on the highway, and that had to fuck with your emotional well-being constantly.
Well, it sent me to. I had to go to Al-Anon, basically. It sent me screaming into the it sent me screaming into the arms of Al-Anon because I had to figure out how. Because I worked with him for 15 years, so. At that time, it was like more than a third of my life. And not only that, but like it was significant to me for money, and it was significant to me because it was, listen, how many people have a band that lasts 15 years? Not that many people. And how many people put out, me and that guy put out 3 different records together. We worked on like 15 different records for other people. We had a really long we also wrote like 30 songs together, and so we had a really long kind of band creative relationship that I didn't feel that I could bail on because we also had a studio together. That was the other thing. Like I had started a studio business with this crazy person, and moving a studio is like a traumatic event, right? You just don't like I just moved one. It was horribly traumatic. I do not like moving my studio. But anyway, so I was kind of trapped with him. So I had to go to Al-Anon, and I had to learn about codependency, and I had to learn about, I also had to go to therapy. Like I had to have a therapist teach me about boundaries just so I could keep working with Scott Weiland.
Yeah.
Because he was a very sick guy, and he could drive you crazy. In fact, I'll tell you, man, a lot of people, and some very famous people, and a lot of well-known like managers and lawyers and stuff like have all been through the Weiland trauma mill. You know, like I joke around about, you know, like we should start a support group because there are basically more people. I mean, he's dead now, so it doesn't matter. But before he died, there was this huge group of people in LA that just wouldn't play with him anymore or work with him anymore. I just thought like we could have our own meeting every week for trauma survivors.
Did he have any extended period of sobriety during that time? Were there times when you were like, oh, this is worth it because Scott's okay for a while?
Well, I always thought it was worth it whether he was not sober or sober because I really liked the stuff that we were writing. So, you know, that's a weird thing when you're writing stuff. That really the boundaries get weird. But no, he didn't really have. Listen, the longest real sobriety he had, the whole time I knew him, was because he was in county jail. And they had him in county jail for 5 or 6 months. And so he got actually real sober in county jail. And then when he got out, he stayed sober for about 2 months after that. And that was exactly at the time that we started recording Shangri-La-Di-Da, the Stone Temple Pilots record. And so, you know, maybe he had 6 months worth of sobriety. And I remember we went to a big meeting in Beverly Hills, and he spoke at it. And then for a minute there, I thought like this could be the beginning of a real foundation for him. But it didn't last. Like we started making that record, and again, when it was another record that it was very popular to make records in mansions for a while, you know.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned an hour ago, the Counting Crows record that I worked on, that was in a mansion. And STP wanted to do one, and even though Brendan O'Brien didn't think it was a good idea, because he's right, mansions are not studios, and studios are not mansions, but they wanted to do it, so they rented this big mansion in Malibu, and so I didn't live in the mansion. I would drive out there every morning and then leave every night. But the guys all lived in the mansion, and he started chipping, and you could just kind of tell. And I remember we all thought he was sober at the beginning of the record, and everybody was very excited. You know, like Scott's sober, and he's actually got, you know, real sobriety, 6 months of sobriety, which is amazing for him. And, you know, this is 2000. So the STP guys had already been through this ringer for like 6 years. So they've been through the rehab, out, in, out, in, out. I'm better, I'm not better. Book a tour, cancel a tour. They had been through that ringer for a long time. So they were very weary. So anyways, he was sober and we started working on that record. And I remember one night, it was late. It was like 10 o'clock at night, maybe 11 o'clock at night. And I was in the control room with Robert DeLeo, and I don't know if we were doing a guitar or a bass. A lot of people don't know that Robert DeLeo plays a lot of the guitar parts on STP records. He plays a lot of the more like arpeggiated counterpoint kind of stuff. He's really good at that. Anyways, not to diss Dean or Dean plays most of the guitar parts, but there's usually a few on each record that Robert might play. So anyways, we were working on that. And we see car lights out the window. You know, it's really late, and everyone's asleep except for us, as far as we know. We see car lights, and we both kind of go like, oh, look, car lights. And then we kind of get up and look out the window, and we catch a glimpse of Scott's Beamer, you know, going down the long driveway. You know, it's very late. And I just looked at him, and I said, uh-oh. And he looked at me, and he went, yeah, uh-oh. And then, of course, the next day, it was, you know, confirmed that the knucklehead had gone out and went on a bender. So anyways, he had 6 months, and we were all very thrilled, and then he didn't. But, you know what? Listen, I never gave up on him getting sober because, you know, I used to go to this meeting in L.A. I don't know if it's an AA meeting or what. It's kind of private. It's like an invite-only meeting.
Yeah.
A friend of mine used to call it the hush meeting because it's like, shh, don't talk about it.
Sure.
It's like all these rock stars, right? It's like, you know, like all these sober, famous rock stars and their management and lawyers and stuff, and that's what goes to this meeting. And I went to it for a little while. I was invited to it by this guy named Dallas Taylor, who's gone now. Dallas Taylor was the guy that got me sober, so I kind of owe him my life, but he's passed on now. Anyways, Dallas brought me to this meeting back in the day, and I sat in this room, and I listened to guys share who were in the Beatles, right? Like guys like that. And I listened to guys share who were in the Eagles, and I listened to guys share, and they were sober, right? And they were very sober. They were very real sober, not like fooling around, not like at these meetings because their wives wanted them there, not there because their band wanted them there. These guys were sober, sober, sober. And they had been sober for years. And so I look around the room and I see this guy. Another guy that was there was Doug from the Knack, who's passed on now, so I can say his name. But anyway, so there's these guys, and one of the guys from Devo's there, and blah, blah, blah. And I looked around the room and I said, these guys can get sober. It seems like they have to get a little older. And it seems like their band has to kind of fade a little bit, like their fame has to kind of like maybe fade a bit, you know, and then they'll get sober. So I always, you know, when I saw that, I thought, well, Scott will do that too. You know what I mean? Like, you know, things will get bad enough for Scott, like and then he'll do what Doug Flagger did, and he'll get sober.
Yeah.
So I never gave up on him because I saw these other guys that were, you know, arguably more famous than him that had found it in themselves to like surrender themselves and their egos and actually get sober. So I actually kept thinking that he would get sober. I was always afraid that, you know, the grave would overtake him before sobriety did, but I had reason to believe that it was possible.
Yeah. There was a point, as I recall, and there was no public statement, but I remember that there was a Weiland solo tour coming up, and I thought you were going to be on it, and I was making plans to catch you, and then somehow I heard that you were no longer in the organization.
Oh, well, that, you know, we had the studio together for 15 years. We wrote together. I was the co-producer, and I ran everything, basically, for a long time. And so I put the solo band together, right? Like I hired all those guys with Scott's approval. But and it was weird in the very beginning. Scott did not like people he didn't know, and he didn't know that many people, so he didn't really, you know, like he was afraid of strangers basically. Because he, you know, like he did that whole celebrity thing where he kind of lived in his bubble and then eventually regressed to the point where he couldn't put gas in his own car or hang out with people he didn't know or whatever.
Yeah.
So anyways, in the beginning he was really weird with those guys. But, you know, after 10 years of playing together, they started partying with him, right? And I told them in the beginning, the solo band guys, I told them in the beginning, I said, listen, if you party with the boss, you're going to get fired. And it's not going to be me that fires you. It's going to be management. I don't really care what you do, but like, if you party with the boss, they're going to look at you as a threat to his sobriety, and that's a threat to their pocketbook, and they will make you go away. And so they took me at my word, and didn't party with him for the first like 7 years or something. But the last year that I was in the band, he had convinced them all to start partying, and so they were doing huge mountains of blow and shit every night, and I was the sober guy who wasn't there, right? So I was the guy that was back at the hotel while the four knuckleheads were getting super loaded, and Scott had this thing that he would do that a lot of narcissists do, where they just like they pick one person and make them the demon for like that week.
Oh yeah.
I'll be mad at Dana this week, and next week I'll be mad at Slash, and then I'll be mad at Doug, you know? So when we were on solo tour, I became the last solo tours, I became the bad guy, and he would stay up all night getting high, telling those guys how I stole millions of dollars from the record company, which never, ever, ever had billions of dollars, ever. Anyways, so basically what happened is after the last tour that we did that I was on, he called me at one point. I was amazed that he called me and didn't have his manager call me to fire me from the band. And basically what he said is you're the most highest paid guy in the band. And I was the musical director, and I had been around for 15 years. So, I was making more than the other guys. And that's just the way it goes. Musical directors usually make twice what the salaried musicians are.
Yeah. It's an extra job.
Yeah, he called me and he said, I just can't afford you anymore. And I said, yeah, I get it, because I knew how broke he was. Like, I always know, I always knew the management people as well as he did. So I was basically pretty well informed about where he was at. And he was broke for a long time. So eventually he figured out that if he cut me, he could save basically like 2 band members worth of salary, and that would go right into his pocket, and he could just keep paying the other guys the same thing. So he called me and he said, I figured this out. I can't afford you anymore, but I want you to stay in the studio, and I want you to produce the new record. And I thought to myself, you want me to produce a record for a band that you just fired me from? How's that going to work? That's lame. But I didn't say that to him because he couldn't hear something like that. So what I did say to him was, I said, so you got a budget? Because we didn't have a record deal. And I said, so you got a budget? And he said, well, no, we don't have a budget. And I said, so you got a record deal? He's like, no, we don't have a record deal. And I said, well, what are you going to do? He goes, well, we're going to make the record and then we're going to sell it. And then I thought to myself, so you just fired me from the band, which is the only thing that still kind of makes money. And then you want me to produce this record for the band you just asked me that you just fired me from on spec for a guy who's a famous rock star. And I said to him, I have to think about it.
Yeah.
I didn't say no because he couldn't handle that. So I just said, yeah, I'm going to have to think about it. And then the next day I rented a truck and moved out of the studio. And that was how it ended, because he was such a narcissist that you couldn't say no to him without him taking it as a massive betrayal and getting hugely wounded. So if I had said to him like I would say to you, Patrick, if we were having the same conversation, I'd say, Patrick, you just fired me from your touring band, which is the only thing that anybody makes a paycheck off of anymore, because records don't sell. And I said, I'd say, Patrick, and now you want me to produce 5/8 new record on spec, hoping that we can go out and sell it to someone afterwards. And in the back of my mind, knowing full well that making that record was going to be a nightmare because they were all on tons of cocaine. So, yeah. Like a normal person could have just put that all out there and said, yeah, that doesn't sound like a good deal for me, right, man? You understand that, right? But he couldn't. So I just said, let me, actually what I said to him that really made him mad was I said, why don't you get together some songs with the guys and send them to me? I said that to him. It made him kind of mad, but he didn't quite get it. I think he sometimes he didn't get if the humor was too biting, he didn't quite. So he was like, "Oh, all right, well, yeah, okay." And I said, "So, and we'll talk about it. Give me a week," and then I moved out.
So after you sort of disentangled yourself from Scott's web of crazy, did you completely unplug, or did you sort of watch? Because I guess was another year and a half he was alive after you left.
Yeah,
and there was just constantly YouTube videos of terrible Weiland performances here, or stories, and then sort of on the.
Well, I didn't. I watched that one. There's one famous one from Texas, and it's right after Jeremy died. The other guitar player in the band was Jeremy Brown, and he was a really sweet guy. Really sweet, quiet, and a very good guitar player. Very good, but also a raging drug addict. And I he just loved. He was just like me, except I was sober and he wasn't. But and a couple of times Jeremy had asked me about meetings and stuff. He had expressed some interest in sobriety, which I usually took to mean that something probably happened the night before or something like that, but something bad, but. Anyways, he never got sober either. But for the year after I left the band, they made that record Blaster, which is actually a nice record. And Rick Parker, the producer, I know him, and he did a great job, especially since I know exactly what the environment must have been like. Must have been a pretty rough environment for Rick. But anyways,
yeah.
And I never asked Rick for any stories on it because I specifically didn't. I don't really want Like we don't need to. I don't need to know what happened in that last record. But
I mean, it's all variations to the same crazy that you've already lived through.
Yeah, exactly, and really don't need to know too much more about it. But
yeah.
So anyways, it's kind of nice because I was always the main guitar player, and Jeremy was always the accessory guitar player, because that's just the way it was. Because I was there for years before him, and I did most of the recording. And so, I mean, he played on everything, but like, you know, I would play a little bit more because I was a producer, whatnot. But whatever. So Jeremy got to make a record with Scott, and he got to be the main guitar player, and I was actually kind of happy about that. I was like, this is great. You've been smelling my farts for like 8 years, and now you get to be the star, and that's cool. Unfortunately, the night before the record came out, he died. So that was very sad, and I'm still up, you know, I'm still mad about it. You know, like I mean, I know it's unfair to play this game that I'm about to play, but I'm about to play. Whose fault is it? And
yeah.
You know, basically, Jeremy was young when he died. He was probably 36. So when he met Scott, he was probably 28. And he really looked up to Scott. And Scott set a terrible example. Like, Scott was hoovering up fucking pills and blow and just like living a Keith Richards existence in front of a guy who was like 20 years younger than him that you know, took the cue and ran with it, you know? Anyway, so it's not Scott's fault, it's not Jeremy's fault, but, you know, behavior is parroted and things happen. Anyways, Jeremy died. It was very sad. I didn't go to the funeral because I knew that if I went to the funeral, Scott was going to make some kind of scene on me. That's how ugly it was. Like, you know, when you split with narcissists, they freak out. Like, they don't handle it like normal people. So I didn't go to the funeral. I think a couple of the guys were mad at me because of that, but I just didn't want to. I didn't want to have to interact with Scott because I was afraid he was going to make the whole funeral about him, which is exactly what he did when his brother died. He kind of made the whole funeral about Scott. It was really weird.
Yeah.
And that's another like 20-minute story you probably don't want to hear. But so anyways, and then that Texas video came. Then they went on tour anyways. They had no choice because it wasn't like they had the money where they could cancel tours.
Right.
So they went on tour anyways with a new guitar player and a really good guitar player. And there's that video that happened, you know, like a week or two later in Texas where he's singing Vaseline, and he's literally singing it like a zombie, and he's completely not even singing. He's just mumbling. So I wasn't really involved. Like, I didn't go to the funeral, and I still talked to one or two of the guys in the band, but they would give me I don't think they gave me a lot of reporting because they didn't want me to feel bad or whatever, you know. But after the fact, they told me about how it was going, and you know, it was going as you would expect. Like, Scott always wanted to have a band like the Rolling Stones, where they would just buddy around and get really famously fucked up, but also be famously amazing. You know what I mean? Like, that's what he wanted, and STP wouldn't give it to them. Because once you start partying with him, you realize that you don't want to feed that flame. So STP and them, I think those guys partied a bit in the beginning when they were younger, but they realized really quickly they shouldn't party with him because they shouldn't co-sign that kind of behavior. So they stopped partying with him, and Velvet Revolver never partied with him. You know what I mean? Like, they were all older when they got into the band with Velvet Revolver, and they knew better than to, like, you know, make it into a big, like, cocaine session. Like, they had learned that shit, whether they were sober or not, they had learned that shit was bad for business. So they weren't doing it. So finally, with the Wildabouts, he had cultivated a couple of guys that were all good players, and he felt friendly enough with, and also would just stay up all night and just do the whole Scarface thing. That's what he really wanted, you know? And unfortunately, 18 months after what he really, you know, and he got rid of the sober guy. Like, once he got rid of me, I was the sober guy. I was like the den mother, a fucking scout mother on fucking tour. And the guy, you know, like, who wants the sober guy around when you're trying to be the Rolling Stones? Nobody. And so, you know, 18 months later, after he got the band that he always wanted, he was dead.
Yeah, it fucking sucks.
Yeah, it sucks, Pat, but you know,
Based on the information that I have, like there was really no other way it was going to end.
you know, listen, I had this, like I was telling you before about the sober rock stars I've met along the way. I had this image in my head of him in like a 1-bedroom apartment in North Hollywood, and just like, you know, basically hitting a bottom financially and professionally, and finally going fuck it and getting really sober and staying sober. Like I had this, like I was picturing in my head like him in a fucking studio apartment, like just where and him and no one willing to talk to him anymore, and him just like finally making the decision inside himself to go and get sober. I had this visualization in my head that I was, even after we weren't talking anymore, I was still visualizing that, thinking this is going to happen. Like he's going to run out of road. He's going to have to get sober. And unfortunately he didn't. Because the other thing that was going on was he was killing himself. I mean, suicide is a really big part of depression and artistry, right? I mean, I have this conversation every day with people about how, like, someday when they truly map the human genome or whatever they call that thing, they're going to find that certain genes for creativity reside in clusters with genes for bipolarity or major depressive disorder or whatnot. Like, they're going to find that these things happen a lot. That's what explains all the jazz guys and their heroin addictions and, you know, ending up in the psych ward and people killing themselves, right? So Scott was just another one of those guys who was incredibly, he had the creative genius gene, whatever you want to call that gene, but it came with its evil twin, mental illness. And so it was just a downhill race between him running out of road and throwing up his hands and finally getting spiritually able to get sober, and his liver and or heart giving out. And so what happened was the heart won the race, and you know, that's all there was to it. So he, you know, I mean, like, it was this kind of really slow motion suicide is what I call what he was doing his whole life, you know. And in the last, you know, here's the interesting thing. Most of the 15 years that I worked with him, he was trying. Like, he'd go to rehab 2 or 3 times a year, and he would get out, he would try, and he would, and the thing is that, and then he would have a binge, and it would get real ugly, and end up like in, you know, seedy hotel rooms and shit, and then he would get desperate and like go to rehab again. He kept trying, like he kept, like it was like for most of the time I knew him, he knew that he shouldn't be using, and he knew that he should be sober, and he would. But then he would try and then would fail. Then he would try and he would fail. But he was really trying. He actually really believed that he shouldn't be using. And so that was enough for me to go like, okay, I can see that you're trying. But what happened is about a year before our parting of the ways, he stopped. He gave up. He gave up trying. He gave up going to rehab. Like I remember I took him to the last rehab was Los Encinas, where he yelled at me in the fucking place. And that was the last time that he tried. And then after that, he had just given up, like, you know, he wasn't willing to try anymore. And it was 18 months after that he was dead. So, I mean, that, you know, so when people are willing to try, no matter how fucked up they are, no matter how much they stink or how much they puked on themselves or how much they pissed you off, I'm still willing to, like, you know, lend a hand and be of service. But once they give up trying completely, there's absolutely nothing you can do. All you can do is wait.
Yeah, wait it out.
Yeah, wait it out. So it's a bummer. But, you know, the thing that I really feel bad about is the kids. He had these 2 kids, beautiful kids. You know, he didn't leave them financially in a good position at all. He left them actually in a very bad position financially, which really pisses me off because there's no need for that. He could have been squirreling away money for them, and he somehow forgot to. And the other thing is just, you know, like, his mental illness rubbed against their world a lot. I saw it happen. And I know for a fact that probably wasn't great for their early childhood development. So, they're probably, they're going to need some help probably in the future. Maybe not. Maybe they're completely healthy, but he didn't leave them any resources for that either.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, crappy.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about college tuition. I'm talking about like therapy, like fees.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah. So you stuck it out in California for a few more years, but as we both know, the studio economy is really tough these days, and because you got to convince bands like it's worth your time and money to come into my studio that costs X dollars per hour versus doing it in your bedroom. But most musicians at this point, they don't know the difference between like out of phase overheads or comb filtering or any of that. And you were there in Southern California for another 4 years or something? How long's it been?
5 years, I think.
Yeah, and now you're back in New York City.
I definitely took a hit when I stopped working with him.
Yeah.
He brought me a certain amount of work every year. Some years better than others, and that was a bummer. But I was doing okay for the first 3 or 4 years. I had my studio in Pasadena post Weiland. I was doing really well, actually. It's just in the last 2 years that my work has fallen off about 40%, and I have a reason for that. I firmly believe that the Trump economy, which they love to tout as being a great economy, I firmly believe that the Trump tax cut that took $2 trillion out of the economy, right? That $2 trillion that came out of the Trump tax cut came from the bottom third of the economy. It had to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
That $2 trillion they didn't just print an extra $2 trillion and give it to rich people. It came out of our system. And if it came out of our system, it came off the backs of the lower half of the economy. And guess where all of my clients live?
True.
They live in the lower half of the economy. I do not do much work for corporations anymore. Record companies, that's about 5% of my business. 95% of my business is self-funded, independent artists that have to come up with their own recording budgets. And I keep my costs really low, a la Steve Albini. I learned it from Steve so that I can record these independently funded artists. But I've noticed since that fucking Trump tax cut that my people have significantly less money. And here now, it's easy to say that and abstractly claim it, but I mean, let me just give you one tiny example of how this hurt musicians. Let's say you're an Uber driver, which is probably 30% of my clientele, right? Drive Uber because it's great for musicians, especially if you live in a big city and you can go on tour and then come back and start driving again. So let's say you're driving an Uber, and every year you get $800 back for your tax return, right?
Right.
Or $900, whatever. You've been getting that forever, right? If you're a musician, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay. You take your $800 tax return, and the other two guys in your band take their $800 tax return, and you go to Doug's house and you make a record for $3,000, which I can totally do for you. Those guys didn't get that money for the last 2 years. They didn't get that money, and now that seems like a small, example, but it's not just that. That's one little example of where the money came from. But there are all these other places that the money came out of the gig economy, went into the pockets of the 1%ers, and basically, destroyed my business. And that's one of the reasons why I moved back to New York, is because I just financially couldn't compete with LA's, real estate market for square footage for artist space, basically recording space. And I find that I think that's happening. Like I said before, all the big guys are moving their studios in their houses, and or just going out of business, because they can't afford the square footage it takes to do a studio, or they're moving outside the cities. I think a lot of people are moving up here to Rockland County to get away from the rents, and so that they can keep being artists,
Yeah.
But, it remains to be seen if I'm going to be able to keep the studio thing afloat in the Trump economy. I don't know yet because I've changed venues. But, I'm telling you, we got hit. Creatives got hit. Artists, gig economy people, independents just got kicked right in the anus by the Trump tax cut. And, he wants to talk about how great the economy is going because the job numbers are down and the 401ks are up. But that basically means nothing in the real world of the middle class.
How you doing? How's your brain?
My brain's fucked up. But my brain's always fucked up. I've always had anxiety, and I've always had dysthymia. And dysthymia is basically what the shrinks call like low grade, constant depression, right? So I've always had that my whole life. But it's funny. You asked about the Chihuahua at the beginning of the conversation. About 5 years ago, the Chihuahua died, and it really fucked me up. Like, it really fucking fucked me up big time. Put me into a really big tailspin. And then 4 weeks later, Weiland died, right? So I was still reeling from the Chihuahua. And I know it sounds funny to equate a Chihuahua to a guy. But to me, a man that has no children, a Chihuahua could very well be more important than a man. Anyways.
Yeah, before we turn the microphones on, Doug and I talked about the studio dog that he had for years.
Yeah.
That was in lots of the photos from the studio and was your constant companion. You guys went everywhere, like when you went and run errands and stuff too, right?
Oh, yeah. He was he was so small you could take him anywhere.
Yeah.
So I'm glad, just good you cleared that up. The story wouldn't make much sense.
Yeah. And so that sort of persistent melancholy has been kind of sticking with you, huh?
Well, no, that's the way it's been my whole life since third grade. Mm-hmm. But, so the Chihuahua died, then Weiland died, and then like 2 months later, my depression changed. My depression switched gears from what they call dysthymia to major depressive disorder. Like, it totally got worse. And so I went on to Lexapro, which actually helped a lot. And I'm still on the Lexapro. The problem is, when I'm in my normal life, when money's okay or whatever, not crisis mode, and when my health is okay, and when my work is okay, and I take my meds, I'm pretty good. But then there are situational periods, like, say, getting separated from your wife, where things get worse and the meds don't really touch it. And so I've been in that for like the last 2 months. So just like struggling with my depression where the medication isn't really that efficient right now because I have all this extra situational like stress.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at right now. Like I told you before, when I got to New York, I was riding this big kind of adrenaline wave that helped me get out of my studio and pack up my studio and all this like extra energy I needed to muster to do this. And moving a studio is like a Sisyphean task. It's fucking.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's almost better to just sell everything and buy it again, except that you're never going to get prices on that stuff like you got it the first time again,
I did a lot of that too. Yeah, I had to do. I actually gave at the end of it. I just threw away I threw away a really big like nice producer's desk. I threw away a bunch of fucking bass traps. My wife threw them out, but anyways.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I'm just, but in the last week or so, I've come out of it. Like I'm beginning to pull out of it, and a lot of it has to do with just trying to get, like, when you're moving and you're screaming across the country in your Hyundai and with your dog and your tail between your legs. You're not really thinking about diet. You're not thinking about exercise. You're not thinking about any of that kind of stuff. So, after the first few weeks of me just kind of like hiding out in this cave here in New York, licking my wounds and just kind of feeling my feelings, I'm coming out of it now, and I'm starting to work again, and I'm starting to eat better stuff. I'm starting to exercise every day. I'm starting to do all those things that you need to do if you have real depression, but those kind of things get really hard when you're in crisis mode, So anyways, I'm starting to do some, just some lifestyle stuff that's helping my mindset. Plus I'm starting to work. Like I got my, I'm doing a lot of video stuff nowadays. And so I'm doing a instructional video for a Guitar Center brand. and basically they're waiting for it back in California, and I've just been sitting on it for like a month, so I have to get it out, and it's, so that's making me kind of like work, and that's good because work makes you feel better. It keeps me from fucking sitting in the corner and bobbing.
Right. Yeah. Well, man, I usually wind these things up with a series of 10 questions that are loosely based on the questions from inside the Actors Studio, although I have my own questions. But if you're up for that, we can jump in.
Sure.
All right. So there's no right or wrong answers, of course. Just go with whatever your first best impulse is. First question is, what is your fondest memory of a meal that you've had?
Of a meal?
Yeah.
I guess the fondest memory of a meal. I had a girlfriend in New Orleans once, and she had a big family, like 8 kids, and a big house in the Garden District, and they invited me to Thanksgiving one year, and I remember they had a turkey, they had a goose, and they had a duck. And I was so impressed by the poultry selection, and it was delicious. And I really love Thanksgiving, so
yeah,
I'll never forget that one. So there you go.
Did you have a preference of those 3 birds after you'd had a little bit of all of them?
I still like the turkey the best, but I enjoy all the fowl.
All right, second question. What is the most frightened you've ever been?
Well, Weiland used to have this house at the top of a mountain in eastern Washington State. And you literally had to drive like a half an hour up a mountain dirt road to get to it from town. And it was a big mansion-y kind of log cabin thing, He had developed a love for this town. It's a very long story. It's a funny fucking story, but you'll have to wait for the reason why he was in this town. Anyway, so he made this house, and he got 2 snowmobiles because he really loved the snowmobiles. And I agreed to go up there one weekend to record. And so, I flew up there with, a little M-box and some instruments. And he didn't want to record, obviously. He just wanted me to go up there. And so the first night we're there, he's totally drunk and fucked up. And he's like, we're going out on the snowmobiles. And it was me, and it was this other guy, Joseph, that was there. And we kind of looked at each other, and in our minds, we drew straws. because we knew there was only one other snowmobile, and we knew somebody had to go to make sure he didn't die, and we knew it was going to be dangerous. So I lost, and I went. So we go off into the night, like the nearest neighbor's like 5 miles away or something. We just go off into the night down this road, and everything seems pretty cool. And at one point, he's like, "We got to go out in the field here." And I was like, "No, I don't." It was pitch black out there, man.
Yeah.
And I'm not even wearing like a winter coat. I came from LA, right? So I'm wearing like this kind of lame LA version of a winter coat. I've got some lame LA version of boots on. You know what I mean? Like nothing's really made for cold weather. And he takes me out into this field in the middle of nowhere, and he's racing around this field. And at one point, we hit this gully or something. I don't know what happened, but like the snowmobiles just buried themselves in like, you know what I mean? Like we must have hit like a gully that was full of 6 feet of snow or something. And when we stopped for some reason to talk or something, and like the snowmobiles just kind of like buried themselves. And when we tried to leave, we couldn't. We just dug the snowmobile. So we're basically in the middle of this field at the top of this mountain in eastern Washington. No cell phones, no flashlights, no direction home. Can't get the fucking snowmobile. And like, I panicked, and I had a panic attack, like thinking to myself, I literally was thinking to myself, this motherfucker killed me. This motherfucker, I knew it would happen. I knew this motherfucker was going to get me killed. And I was like, and also the air was very thin, right? So I'm like hyperventilating, having a panic attack,
oh, God.
trying to dig my snowmobile out of this giant, like, snow gully. Maybe it was a snow berm. I don't know what it was, but I really thought that was it. So that was probably the scariest I've been.
So what happened?
We dug them out. It took like 20 minutes to dig them out, and then we moved them on, and we got stuck again, and we dug them out again. It literally took like forever. And then he wanted to keep going. And I was like, no, I'm not going anymore. I'm done. I'm not digging this thing out again. I'm freaking out. You know, and you could have a full-on panic attack in front of the guy, and like he would overlook it because he was that kind of a narcissist and empathy don't really go together. So
yeah,
he wanted to keep going, and I was like, no, I'm leaving. I'm going home. And I just, I found the road, thank God, and there's only one road, and so I went the right way, and I ended up back at the house. But like, I really thought he was going to kill me.
Third question: of all the things that you've lost, what is the thing that you regret losing the most?
Losing or selling?
Well, that question comes later.
Well, that's a tough question. I think I regret when my mother lived in New Orleans briefly. She brought all of the family photographs to New Orleans with her, and she left them in the basement of this house, and the basement of the house flooded. It was this house was in a flood zone in New Orleans that I wasn't aware of. So she put every photograph from the whole Grean existence in this basement, and they just all got wiped out. So I think, if you were to ask me that question 20 years ago, I'd probably talk about a guitar or something. But
yeah.
I think those things were the most important.
Yeah.
And we lost them. They're gone. I have like 10 pictures from my youth. That's about it.
Tell me about a time you received an act of kindness from a stranger.
Act of kindness from a stranger. I guess you cut out these really long pauses, huh?
Not always. There have been a couple of episodes where I was talking to somebody who was sufficiently, like, struggling through their sadness that I felt like it was disrespectful to take it out. But if you're just, like, kind of scratching your head, like, there's no reason for me to leave it in. It all depends on the sort of tenor of the interview.
Well, good for you. That's good. That's really...
Episode 10. If you get a chance, I'll send you a link to episode 10. It's the heaviest one I've done, full stop. And I honestly thought that the guy, for the first 2/3 of the interview, I thought, this is a friend's suicide note. This will be the last thing he does. He's going to finish this interview, go home and kill himself.
Jesus.
It was so heavy. And then, like, he finally opened up at the end about how he'd been doing the ketamine infusions and it had totally saved his life. And I was just like, oh, thank God. But I left a lot of that silence in because I felt like it was important.
Well, you're smart, because I'll tell you, it is important. Silence is really important. I'm not so sure my silence in this case is that important, but like in order for you to be emotionally connected enough with what was going on and not just lop it out because that's what engineers do is really cool.
Yeah.
Engineers see a big blank in the waveform and they go like, oh, we got to close that up. But they don't think about, the emotional content of or the impact of pauses.
Yeah.
I think about this stuff a lot more now that I do the whole web series thing, I'm involved in narrative fiction now. So I understand more about, I spend a lot more time thinking about people and how they speak and what makes an actor really good at speaking as if they're really, you know what I mean, doing it.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about Starman, and we haven't even gotten to that, but we might save that for the follow-up interview.
Yeah, we can talk about it another time, but I'll tell you this, though, just as an aside to one musician to another, the analogs between, being a music producer or music maker, I hate the producer word, why, and being a music, creator, and being a video creator, there's many analogs. There's an analog for almost everything. And my attention to starman and dialogue and acting and stuff like that completely informs my music nowadays. And my music, what I know about music and making music and writing songs completely informs the video stuff. It's almost like they are one and the same. And it's really cool because I've learned a lot from the acting aspect that applies to the singing aspect of, like, for example, I didn't used to think like this, but, you know, a song is like a little spell. You know what I mean? And if you're playing a song for somebody, you're casting a little spell. And it, you know, that's why fucking up isn't a good thing. Like, if you hit a bad chord, it's bad because it breaks the spell. So it's like you're casting a spell on people. You're telling this little story. You're creating this little world. And it's the same thing with, you know, a TV show. We're casting a little spell for 22 minutes. We're creating a little world. We've got to get rid of all the hiccups and everything so it doesn't break the spell. And we're telling a story. These are the lyrics. This is how you deliver it, and what, you know, what tone of voice or what pitch or what cadence you deliver it at all has an emotional impact. All those things, they all overlap. It's amazing. I could literally go on for hours. We won't have to do that, but
well, my wife is a theater professional, and so I think of songs as scenes now. After watching her direct, she's a director and actor, but watching her direct, I'm like, oh, we're all working towards the common goal of an emotional note here, and that's why I think the people who are like stuck in stylistic ghettos are doing themselves and the material a huge disservice, because, you know, a song doesn't always need like a merengue drum beat to get the idea across, but there's guys who can't break out.
Just because you're really good at the merengue or you really like it doesn't mean that this song needs it, right? Yeah, I get that too.
Exactly.
You're right. Songs are like scenes, definitely. And the scene needs to be continuous, and it needs to be believable, and it needs to be emotionally in tune with whatever the storyline is. It's all the same. It's amazing.
I think of albums as feature films now. It's all part and parcel of this one thematic emotional whole.
If you're doing it right, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So, act of kindness from a stranger.
I can't think of one. I guess an act of kindness for me was when I was in rehab. I was so fucked up that I didn't really know like what my sobriety date was, right? Because I was on so many like meds and shit. And so after I was in rehab a couple of weeks and I was truly sober, finally, it took a few weeks to detox, and I went to the nurse at the station, and everybody at the rehab was sober, right? Everybody that worked there. And there was a couple of musicians that worked there that were actually very influential to me, because I thought, oh, hey, look, they're musicians and they're sober and they seem happy and they seem cool. And how can that be? But anyways,
right.
There was this nurse, and I still remember her. Her name was Barbara. And I came to her one day at the nursing station. I said, Barbara, I have to go to the meeting tonight, but I don't know when my sobriety date is. Can you look in the books and see? And so she goes, oh, yeah, let me look in the book. And she, like, opened some random book and fished through it, and she looked at it, and she went, oh, yeah, your sobriety date is June 10th. And so I was like, okay, cool, June 10th. And that was my sobriety date for the first 12 years or whatever. And I didn't find out until a year later that June 10th is AA's birthday. June 10th is like the day that they contribute. I guess Bob met Bill, and they had their first kind of meeting or whatever. So it was the day that they attribute the birth of AA. And I think back to that, and I think, she did that on purpose. She could have picked any day. She could have picked any day, like the week or two before I was talking to her, and it could have been my day. But she picked June 10th on purpose and never told me about it.
Man, I love that story. That is so good.
Isn't that nice of her? Yeah. Anyway, she was a sweetheart. So I guess that's my act of kindness. But I'm sure there's been others. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's a funny question just to spring on someone. All of these are, actually. Actually, this one's pretty good. What's your favorite place to gig?
Oh, jeez. I don't really have a favorite place to gig. I mean, I don't know. I guess right now my favorite place to play is the Capitol Theater in Port Chester.
Yeah?
Yeah, there's a theater up here. I was born in this town, Port Chester, New York, and there's a theater here that called the Capitol Theater, and there's a few Capitols. There's one in Paramus, I think, too. But the Capitol Theater in Port Chester was a really big concert venue in the 60s and the 70s. Like, my aunt went there and saw everybody. And then it was closed for years. It was just derelict. And this guy, this deadhead, a really rich deadhead dude named Peter Shapiro bought it. And he refurbished it, and it's beautiful now. And I didn't know it at the time, but apparently it was Jerry Garcia's favorite venue. And so they made a little, there's a nightclub that's part of the theater, and they call it Garcia's. And it actually has all these pictures of Garcia. And listen, I'm not really a deadhead anymore, but I still really have huge love for Jerry Garcia. And so when I go there, it's a happy place for me. So just nice. And they really did a beautiful job. Like, it's all old brick and nice sound systems. And the one thing the Deadheads do when they build a venue, they fucking make nice sound systems. There's a venue in, this is probably my second favorite venue, Sweetwater in Mill Valley in California, is a club that's associated with one of the Grateful Dead guys. And check this out. You'll when you go to the front of house position at this place, they have all API preamps, all API like 512 preamps in 500 series housings, like mounted in the wall, just for the PA, just for the front of house.
That's unbelievable.
And then in the back room, they have a whole nother studio. So they've got nothing but API and like really nice, distressors and shit, like at the front of house. Like, they basically have studio quality everything everywhere. And when I walked in and saw it, I was just like, holy shit. And then I realized, oh, it's owned by Deadheads, right. So one thing that Grateful Dead people really love is, pristine audio. And they actually, the Grateful Dead offshoot companies invented the EMG pickup. They invented the alembic-style guitar. They invented Myers Sound, invented the, how they delay concert sound so the concert so the stacks out in the audience are in the same time as the stacks on the stage. You know how they do that? They do timed arrays, they call it, I think. Either a delayed array or a timed array. Well, they invented that too. So they invented all these really interesting sound technological things that are now commonplace in every venue. So the tradition of the Grateful Dead people is that they really care about audio. And so when you go to one of their venues, if you're an engineer, you're always blown away because you're like, holy shit, there's $50,000 worth of mic pre's here.
Yeah, no shit. So visa and income considerations aside, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you live?
I live in New Orleans, probably.
Yeah.
I almost moved back there, but I don't have family there anymore. Most of all my family there has moved on. So I decided to move back to be closer to family. We've got some medical issues and stuff here in the family right now. So, just with old people getting old, so I almost moved back there, but it's fucked up. The rents there are almost as bad as LA now. When I lived there, it was $250 for an apartment. I had a 2-bedroom apartment for $250. It was walking distance to Audubon Park. It was fucking beautiful. It wasn't the nicest apartment, but it was a beautiful spot. And now I went back and looked at the prices, and it was basically the same thing. And I would, kind of have to start over again. So I didn't go back. But New Orleans is probably where I'd live.
Yeah, I have an old friend who's a theater professional like my wife, and she was living in New Orleans, and she said, if I'm going to have to pay these rents, I'm moving to New York where I can get more work.
Exactly. It's very similar to New York. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's Airbnb. It's a tourist town, so Airbnb is taking over all the rental properties. So
it's true. Yeah, I think it's done a big. It's funny how this weird new gig economy, this weird new app economy, is remaking the world in different ways. You know what I mean? It's definitely remakes industries overnight. It remade the taxi industry within a year. Uber. You know what I mean? And then And then it remade the music delivery system, and it remade the video delivery system, and it just remakes the world overnight sometimes. And sometimes it's good for you, and sometimes it's bad for you. If you're a hotel owner in New Orleans, it's probably horrible for you.
Yeah, or an actor. Do you have an ideal musical instrument? And if you do you already own it or not?
I don't have an ideal musical instrument really. I usually just I got like 6 or 8 guitars, but I usually only have one that's my favorite at any given time, and I'll play that. So right now I'm playing this Eastman guitar that they gave me. It's a really nice instrument, and so that's just my favorite thing for the last couple of years, and there may be another one in another year or two, but I'm pretty happy with this thing.
You were a big semi-hollow guy for a while, as I recall.
Yeah, that's what this thing is. The Eastman guitar I have is basically a 335 ripoff, but it's made in China by hand. It's made by a company, Eastman, that made violins for years, and they just, I guess, in the last 10 or 15 years, poured it over to making guitar instruments, but they don't make any solid body instruments. Everything is a hollow body. And in fact, the one I have is almost a true hollow body in that it doesn't have a block that goes all the way through. It just the neck attaches to the body, and then there's a block underneath the bridge, and that's it. So it's not a semi-hollow body. It's not an acoustic guitar, but it definitely, the good thing about those things is they live. Like when you put them into a Marshall and crank it up, you can feel the wood vibrating,
Yeah. It resonates. Yeah.
Resonates and feeds back and has a lot of extra, I think it has a lot of extra tonal information because the body's actually doing something as opposed to just sitting there like a Les Paul body, which is just like a piece of stone, it doesn't do much.
Yeah. Just holding the pickups.
Anyways, so I'm a hollow body guy. I guess my dream instrument would be a really nice vintage 335, but I can't afford those fucking things.
I go to Grean. It's like a petting zoo for those. When I'm in Nashville, I hit Grean and I go to the petting zoo and I touch the guitars and
right. Yeah. You pet the animals you could never hope to own.
Right, and then I just go around the corner to 8th and Roast coffee shop and sit there and think about what it'd be like to win the lottery. So of all the instruments you've owned, is there one that you had to let go, whether it was stolen or it was pawned or something like that you just desperately wish you could have back?
Yeah, there is. I had a 69 jazz bass that was such a beautiful instrument. It was refinished, kind of poorly, which is the way I usually buy vintage instruments. But it was very light and lively and was just a beautiful instrument, and I sold it when I was on drugs. I basically traded it for, what did I get for it? I got $500 cash. I got a 1976 Gibson EB bass, the SG bass.
Yeah,
and then I also got a microphone. But really, the whole reason why I traded it was for the money so that I could go get some drugs. But, yeah, I think about that fucking bass every day. I think about it every day, and I think, God damn it, why did I'm not even really, I play a lot of bass in the studio. I'm not a bass player mostly by trade, but, man, that's the instrument I miss. I'm bummed about that guy.
What was the finish on it?
It was just kind of a red wood finish, It was refinished by somebody poorly, but I don't care about it. I have a lot of refinished old guitars. I love them. And it's really the only way that we can afford, like, as a working musician, the only way you can afford a real instrument of vintage quality is if it's refinished. You're not going to be buying any of those, perfectly, like, museum quality Strats from the 60s because they're just too fucking expensive.
If you could be a guest with any artist for one song at a show and play that song, who would you guest with?
Fuck. That's a hard one. I would probably guess with somebody. Who would it be? I don't know. I played with a lot of my idols, so usually it didn't turn out well. But living or dead?
Doesn't matter.
Oh, I see. It doesn't matter. Well, I'd probably sit in with Jerry Garcia then, just because I love Jerry Garcia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would sit in with Jerry just because, like the Grateful Dead people are really good at sit-ins. But if you wanted to ask me, if you asked me that same question, what musician could I guest like in the studio with, like work with on a song in the studio, my answer would be completely different. My answer would be Trent Reznor.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Is he still in New Orleans?
No, I don't think. I think he's in L.A.
Yeah.
He had a studio that was a former funeral parlor, right? Didn't he?
Yeah, I heard something like that. I think that is absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah, what a freak, right? But yeah, that guy is one of my idols that no one really knows about. But like I don't talk about my Nine Inch Nails fixation that much. But there was a time in my life when I just wanted to be Trent Reznor. I just wanted to be that guy.
He's the guy who sort of like waves the flag for like chronic depressives.
He does, so. and he's also the poster child for taking those feelings that you're saddled with and turning them into like the highest form of art. I think, you know what I mean. Like his songs are so painful, but also so awesome at the same time. It's really hard to, like, I can take my depression and turn it into art, but it's not as much fun.
Yeah. All right, this is the last question. If you could imagine a taxi that could go anywhere in time or space, it's not constrained by the sort of reality we think of as taxis, and you climb into this taxi and you say to the taxi driver, "Hey man, take me home." Where's home?
Oh fuck. I would want him to take me to Montauk, New York. You ever been there?
I have.
Yeah.
But not in many, many, many years.
Well, it's just a little vacation town at the end of Long Island, but it's where my family used to go every year, like every summer. It seemed like when I grew up, every family had like a place they'd go every summer. Like some people went to Nantucket, some people went to Martha's Vineyard. We would go to Montauk, and it's kind of like my happy place. So I would probably tell the taxi to take me to Montauk, to my house on a hill overlooking the ocean.
Yeah.
There's no hills out there, though. But, it's fantasy.
Do you ever get up there anymore, or is it just...
I went there with my ex 2 or 3 years ago. We went out there. It was really lovely. I had a good time. And, yeah, it's that place that you spent a lot of happy time as a child. So, that place is always going to be a happy place, usually. Nothing traumatic happened there. I guess that's the best thing I can say about that.
Yeah. Man, I really appreciate you doing this. This has been an amazingly deep interview. I've got so much more than I had even dared hope for.
You know what? I tried to do a podcast for a while, and it's very difficult, especially when people talk as much as I do, because you're going to have to listen to every fucking word.
I don't mind the editing. I don't actually
really
enjoy it. Yeah,
wow,
I really like it. It's very meditative. I go deep, and I'm like, for hours, I'm just kind of riveted to it, and then at some point I look up and like, oh, it's 4:00 in the morning.
I did a podcast for my non-existent podcast with Kim Shattuck, and I never posted it. And I really need to go and edit it and post it now that she's passed.
You want to do a guest Crash and Ride thing? We could put it on
maybe
network and
yeah. Let me see what I got. I was trying to do a post. I was trying to do a thing with a friend, and it was all about the guitars you were buying, the guitars you were selling, and the guitars that you wish you had never sold. So it was kind of about like Craigslisting, you know what I mean? Like, so we would go deep on like, what did you find on Craigslist this week? And then we would tell funny stories about like, how you go on these Craigslist like meet and greets, and like you meet the weirdest people, like you end up at some dude's house, and like, he's selling you this patch bay, but he also breeds chinchillas. You know, that kind of story.
God, that's so true to life, man.
So we were trying to do this podcast, so I know what it's like to edit them. So I know it's a long slog. But if you like it, God bless you.
Yeah, I'm really glad we're able to do this. So thank you.
My pleasure, man. It's good to talk to you.
All right, that's episode 52. Man, I really love that guy so much. I'm really glad he was able to do this. I realize this is like a super long episode, and my apologies if you're like, man, I got to get out of the car and go in here to work, but I can't stop listening to this guy talk about these insane stories. I ended up being like 15 minutes late for practice the other day because I was like, I can't wind this down. This is too interesting. So I feel you, man. I'm sorry. Thanks to Jake Kreger, our producer. He sends me show notes after every show to let me know what I did right and what I did wrong. So if the show's better now than it was the first time you heard it, that's due to Jake. You know, I put this thing up on Facebook last week about mental health and about service members, like combat vets. I saw this thing, like another Afghanistan or Iraq war vet shot himself in the parking lot of a VA hospital, and like my brain just like burst like a balloon. Like I just lost my mind for a minute. I was like, I can't just sit by and do nothing while this keeps happening. Like, I'm not a combat veteran. I have a ton of them in my family. So I reached out to a guy on Facebook who's a PTSD survivor and a combat veteran, and hopefully in the next few weeks we're going to be sitting down with some other combat vets, and I'm going to put microphones up and start the recording and then just get out of the way and let those guys like talk it out. There's going to be a new podcast. We don't have a name for it yet, but I'll let you know as soon as that goes up. Thanks to Gene Wolfolk and the Powder Room. They provide almost all of the music for every episode. The first song you hear at the top of the episode, the little bumper, and what you're hearing now underneath my voice is all the Powder Room. You can go to thepowderroom.bandcamp.com to learn more, download some of their music. You can also check out Gene's new band called Dream Tent. That's at dreamtent.bandcamp.com, DREAMTENT.bandcamp.com. Gene is an extraordinary musician. He's somebody I care about a whole lot. I hope you'll check out his music. Thanks to Heil Audio for these two PR40 microphones that I use on just about every episode. I got a really nice deal on them, but I had been using the PR40 in the studio years ago for a snare drum and kick drum and bass cabinet. Turns out they're also great broadcast mics. I really like them. If you're thinking about upgrading the microphones for your podcast, I'd highly suggest checking into the Heil PR40. All right, I am finishing this at 1:20 in the morning, an hour and 20 minutes after I usually get episodes up. So apologize to anybody that's like driving home from the gig tonight and being like, where's the new Crash and Ride? What the fuck, Patrick? What the hell? You guys know how seriously I take this. I really want to get these out on time and do every episode that I promised you. So bear with me. It's been a bumpy January. But so until we speak again, take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. Ask for help if you need it. Go see live music. Support your favorite band. And remember, loud guitars save lives.